There was still some time before the holidays began. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere in the castle became oddly subdued. In previous years at this time, Hogwarts would be buzzing. Exams finished, end-of-term reports handed out, trunks half-packed. Everyone on edge with excitement for the holidays. The corridors would echo with chasing and laughter. The banks of the Black Lake would be full of sunbathers, and the Quidditch pitch would host flights from dawn till dusk. Now, there was almost nothing. On most days, you could hardly find young witches and wizards outdoors. Occasionally, a few would glance in Harry's direction from a distance, then look down and hurry away. The reason was obvious. Parents had been sending owls. Lately, flocks of owls had been streaming to the headmaster's office at the top of the tower. The sight was striking, birds sweeping across the Black Lake, flapping to squeeze through the round window. Some carried letters by beak, some had parcels on their claws, and some crashed in so hurriedly a few feathers floated around. From inside the office, muffled scoldings drifted through the thick stone walls. Dumbledore's public statement about you-know-who had not soothed many parents. Some refused to believe Voldemort had returned. They preferred to call it a misunderstanding, the ramblings of a senile old headmaster. No one reacted more strongly than the Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge. The morning after Dumbledore's announcement, copies of the Daily Prophet arrived at Hogwarts. There was nothing about Voldemort on the front page, only Harry. Whether at Fudge's prompting or not, the paper painted Harry as no less unhinged than Dumbledore. It suggested that, for attention, he and Dumbledore had invented an outrageous tale linking his scar with the Dark Lord. Harry Potter now seems to have fallen into some kind of paranoid delusion, the article declared. At the Slytherin table, a boy held up a copy and read aloud, sneering. According to reliable sources, Mr. Potter claims to have personally witnessed the resurrection of you-know-who and insists the Dark Lord has returned. The Ministry of Magic officially denies this. Minister Cornelius Fudge stated there is no evidence to support this absurd accusation. Harry kept his head down at the Gryffindor table, his fork digging into his plate. Ron sat beside him, face flushed, fists clenched. "Stop gloating," he snapped toward the Slytherin. "What's the matter, Weasley? Is your family too poor to get a newspaper? I'm just doing you a favor reading it to you, and you're not grateful?" Ron rose abruptly. Hermione caught his arm. "Don't go. You might not be able to beat him." The Slytherin spread his hands and continued. "The scar on Mr. Potter's forehead seems to be the basis of his delusion, but experts at St. Mungo's say occasional pain in old scars is normal and has nothing to do with the Dark Lord." At the Hufflepuff table, Lynn watched without speaking. He looked down at the copy of the Daily Prophet in front of him. Harry's photo on the front page was enlarged, a picture of him on the Triwizard podium holding the cup, wearing an odd, caught smile. Below it, the headline read, "Harry Potter, Hero or Liar?" He turned the page. The second page was all about Dumbledore. The headline was even more sensational, "Dumbledore, from Great Wizard to Panic Monger." The article portrayed the headmaster as an old fool spreading panic to prove himself right. Lynn clicked his tongue and flipped through further. A short piece caught his eye. "Order of Merlin, first-class recipient Lynn, the silent warrior." It noted that after the award ceremony, reporters had pressed him for comment and he had remained silent. Some called it arrogance. Others called it modesty. Lynn shrugged and set the paper aside. The day after the end-of-term feast was the official start of the holidays. The castle woke early. Trunks and luggage lined the corridors, owls fluttered overhead, and house elves hurriedly straightened beds and put robes and bedding back where they belonged in the common rooms. Farewells echoed. "See you next term." "Remember to write. Don't take my book." Lynn and his roommates went to the station together to catch the Hogwarts Express. By the time they ambled there, the train was almost ready to leave. They wandered from carriage to carriage. Every compartment they passed was full. "None left. Everywhere's full," someone muttered. "There's another section back there." William pushed up his glasses and pointed to the very last carriage. They hauled their trunks down the platform and found an empty compartment at the far end. Inside sat a dozing Hufflepuff girl, younger than them. At the sound of the door, she blinked awake, froze when she saw Lynn, blushed and fled, clutching her bag. "Hey!" Edgar called. but she was gone. Do we look that scary? Edgar scratched his head. Maybe she's just shy. Lynn heaved his trunk onto the rack and sat by the window. The train lurched and began to move. Hogwarts shrank behind them. The black lake became a silver ribbon, and the tops of the forbidden forest gleamed green in the sun. For a while, the compartment was quiet. The conversation drifted to Voldemort. Lynn, Edgar said, leaning back and staring into the distance, voice softer than usual. Do you think the headmaster expected things to turn out like this? Not many people seem to be believing him. Lynn thought a moment. I don't think he necessarily wants everyone to believe. He just wants everyone to be prepared. Edgar considered that and nodded. William pushed his glasses up, non-committal. Speaking of preparing, Lynn flicked his wand and the lid of his trunk popped open. Several long gift boxes rose out and hovered in a neat row. The three of them stared. The boxes were long and narrow, dark wood with brass-bound corners, the grain gleaming under the carriage light. This, Edgar leaned in. Why does this look so much like a wand box? Congratulations, you've got a brain, Lynn said. There are wands inside. The lids opened all at once. 3 wands lay on deep red velvet. Their shafts were polished smooth and warm to the touch. The grain showed clearly. A small piece of silvery metal was set in each handle, engraved with runes. Walnut, fox's feather, 13.5 inches, Lynn said casually, picking one up and twirling it between his fingers. He pointed the wand at the heavy advanced transfiguration tome William had left on the table. Transfigure, a soft glow flashed. The weighty textbook turned into a toad in an instant. The toad sat on the table, puffed its cheeks, and croaked twice. William stared, then at Lynn. So you prepared these wands just to turn my books into toads? Lynn waved the wand, and the toad reverted to the book. Of course not. He handed the 3 wands to his companions. Think of this as an extra bit of security. They took the wands and examined them. They felt perfectly balanced and comfortable to hold. Edgar began to grin. Although I think Vol. He choked and coughed, then cleared his throat. Fine. You know who shouldn't know he took a beating from me, Lynn said, tone flat as a board. Edgar nearly choked on his spit. Beating Voldemort. Was he even speaking human? Lynn went on, unfazed. The cores of these wands, like Voldemort's, are from fox's feathers. They're phoenix feather cores. All 3 stopped moving. Twin cores? William said, pushing his glasses up. You mean? Yes, Lynn nodded. When wands with phoenix feather cores duel, they can produce a special priori incantatum. He arranged his words carefully. Simply put, when your wand clashes with Voldemort's wand, his wand will recognize the phoenix feather in your core, and then, he looked at them. It'll regurgitate the spells it has cast before. The compartment fell almost perfectly quiet, except for the click-clack of the wheels on the track. So, William said slowly, if we ever met him, this wand could buy you a little time to call for help, Lynn finished for him. Not much, but enough. Of course, that's if you survive his first move, Edgar added, looking down at the wand in his hand. He slipped it carefully into his pocket, looked up, and grinned despite himself. Then I definitely won't survive. Lynn gave him a look. Edgar shrugged and took a big bite of his meat pie. So it's better if you do it, he mumbled. Mouthful. You're better at fighting. Lynn glanced at William and Ollie. William had already tucked his wand away, pushed up his glasses, and said matter-of-factly, just in case. Ollie didn't speak. He just rolled the wand gently in his palm. Lynn nodded in satisfaction. Come on, don't be shy. Take a few more. He reached into his trunk and pulled out several more boxes, piling them on the small table with a clatter. The 3 of them stared. Edgar's mouth twitched. How many feathers did you take from Fawkes? Not many, Lynn said after a beat. Just enough. If Fawkes had been listening, he'd have protested loudly. Lynn didn't expect any of them to actually face Voldemort, but having a few extra wands for practice and for peace of mind couldn't hurt. The train rolled on. The fields slid past, the hills rose and fell, and sunlight warmed the stack of wand boxes. Edgar shoved the last of his pie into his mouth, brushed crumbs off his hands, and pointed his wand at William's book. Transfigure. Nothing. He waved it again. Still nothing. William moved the book further away without expression. Can you stop using my book for your experiments? Sheepish, Edgar withdrew his wand and began a new round of attempts on his own backpack. Lynn yawned and closed his eyes. One afternoon during the holidays, harsh sunlight pierced the gaps in the curtains and landed squarely on the eyelids of the young man sleeping on the bed. Lynn frowned, rolled over, and buried his face in the pillow, but the light pursued him like it had a mind of its own, determined to drag him out of his dreams. He struggled for a while before resigning himself and opening his eyes. His lids were heavy, his head felt like it had been filled with paste, and he couldn't summon a single coherent thought. When his eyes finally opened, it was as if someone had thrown a flashbang at him. Who am I? Where am I? What was I supposed to be doing? He stared at the ceiling, plain, white, and as blank as his mind. Having a holiday was turning him into a complete couch potato. Every day was the same: eat, drink, sleep, use the bathroom, and fish. He woke naturally, and Dudu already had breakfast waiting. After eating, he'd spend the morning by the lake, whether he caught anything or not. Back for lunch, a nap, then back to the lake in the afternoon. Evenings were for dinner, a little reading, and bed. Day after day, the cycle repeated. Living like this, he was almost forgetting how to hold a wand. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, he seriously contemplated humanity's ultimate philosophical question: what to eat for lunch? Grilled fish? No, he was tired of fish. Braised pork? Dudu made it great, but he'd had it 3 days running. Maybe go out, hot pot, stir fry, or just a simple burger. The phone suddenly blared, tearing him out of his culinary reverie. Lynn scratched his bedhead, reached for the phone on the nightstand, and squinted at the caller ID. Edgar. He answered, and before he could speak, the voice on the other end practically cracked with excitement. Lynn, guess where I am right now? Lynn yawned and nested back in the pillow. How am I supposed to guess? Tell me or I'm hanging up. Hey, don't hang up, Edgar protested. Just look. He flipped his camera so Lynn could see. The screen wobbled for a moment before steadying. Lynn squinted and then saw it. The Statue of Liberty, enormous and green against an azure sky dotted with lazy clouds. Tourists swarmed, some snapping pictures, some craning their necks skyward, children chasing one another. You ran off to another country on the public dime again? Lynn teased. Don't put it like that. Edgar sounded offended. I didn't come here for a holiday this time. Lynn raised an eyebrow. You're here to study? Exactly. Edgar adopted a solemn tone. To learn from the advanced management of foreign ministries of magic so I can go back to Britain and better serve the wizarding world. Lynn couldn't help a smile. Learn how to be Commissioner Smith and embezzle ministry funds. Careful, or I'll tell William Smith, Edgar shot back. William isn't that petty, Lynn said, rolling into a more comfortable position. They chatted idly while Edgar described visiting the American Ministry building yesterday. Grand, with dedicated coffee machines, and strolling the streets today, where American wizards dressed far flashier than their British counterparts, some even wrapped in stars and stripes robes that were an eyesore. Lynn chimed in occasionally. Suddenly, Edgar's voice jumped several octaves. Oh, right. I think I saw Mr. Scamander here. Lynn paused. Which Scamander? Which else? Edgar sounded incredulous. The one who wrote Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. He kept rummaging all over the streets, Edgar continued, baffled, checking trash cans, peering through bushes, even lying on the ground to look into sewers. Lots of people stared, but he didn't seem to care. Lynn pictured Newt Scamander rummaging through trash and peering down sewers and couldn't reconcile the image with the dignified author he knew. Then his phone buzzed again. A different name lit the screen. Headmaster Dumbledore. Edgar, wait a second. I'm taking another call, Lynn said, switching apps and answering promptly. Headmaster, he greeted, the edge of excitement coming through. Have you found Voldemort's location? I'm on my way. There was a beat of silence, then a soft sigh. Child, Dumbledore said, voice threaded with gentle reproach, do try not to be so violent in your assumptions. Lynn bristled inwardly. He hadn't meant violence, just facts, but said, all right, what's on your mind? Dumbledore rustled paper. Fawkes made a low chirp in the background. It's like this, he said carefully. I have an old friend who has run into trouble in the United States. He hesitated, then added, Newt Scamander, you should have met him. Lynn remembered Edgar's description. Trash cans, sewers, the streets. What happened to Mr. Scamander? In the suitcase he carries are some rather special creatures, Dumbledore replied. One of the young ones took advantage of a lapse in his attention and escaped. Lynn fell silent. If anything had gotten out of Newt's suitcase, it would be front-page news. He needs someone to help him find it now, Dumbledore continued. The little fellow is very special. Ordinary tracking charms won't work. I need someone sharp, someone who knows magical creatures, and, he paused, voice turning wry, someone who won't get lost while looking for it. Lynn felt the last remark aimed at him. So you thought of me? Yes. Dumbledore sounded sheepish. I know this is sudden. Fawkes hasn't been well and cannot make long flights, and there are matters here I cannot leave. Lynn understood. Dumbledore couldn't go himself. So you're sending me. If you are unwilling, I'll go, Lynn said firmly. He was bored anyway. A relieved chuckle came down the line. Thank you, child. There is one more thing. Dumbledore's voice softened into the hint of a smile. Help Newt find that little fellow, and no matter what mistake you make in the future, the Black Lake will no longer be off limits for your fishing. Lynn's eyes lit up. That was far more practical than any other favor. Deal. I will send you the specific location, Dumbledore said. Stay safe, child. Chapter 303. The Taciturn Newt. Lynn hung up and sprang out of bed. He first slipped his wand into his sleeve, then rifled through the cabinet for the almost unused passport. He'd last traveled to Norway, and Dumbledore had helped him sort the paperwork then. Had it expired? Checked. The validity was still long. He fished a small pouch of galleons from a drawer and shoved it into his pocket. After a moment's thought, he took another pouch. Just in case. Dudu poked his head out from the kitchen. Is Master going out? Yeah, going to the United States. Dudu paused. The United States? For how long? Lynn considered. Hard to say. A few days, maybe. There was a long silence. Then should Dudu come along? Lynn waved him off. No need. I'm not going to a duel this time. Dudu's face clearly read rowing. I don't believe you, but he didn't argue. Instead, he packed a bag of freshly baked cookies and thrust it into Lynn's hand. Eat them on the way. Lynn accepted the cookies, patted Dudu's head, and turned to leave. He had thought about having Wuan port him straight there, fast and easy, but Dumbledore had insisted he take some documents and go to the ministry first to see Tonks. The old principal had sounded unusually embarrassed over the phone. The International Confederation of Wizards has been strict lately. You can't get in without formal procedures. Lynn had wanted to say Wuan could bypass all inspections, but the words caught in his throat. Better safe than sorry. He made his way to central London and slipped down a narrow, cluttered alley. Near the deepest end stood an abandoned red telephone booth. One pane of glass was shattered, a note reading "out of order" stuck to the door, and dust coated the outside. Lynn pushed the door open and stepped in. Inside looked older still. The phone buttons were heavily worn and the receiver cracked. The number, he recalled, was 62442. He pressed the buttons. A calm female voice answered, Welcome to the Ministry of Magic. Please state your name and purpose. Lynn, traveling abroad. There was a brief pause, then a click and a silver token dropped into the coin return slot. Lynn picked it up and pinned it to his chest. The booth lurched and began to descend. He grabbed the handrail as the light above narrowed and faded until only the floor under his feet glowed faintly. The descent was steady, like an elevator. When the door popped open, it revealed the atrium on the 8th underground floor of the ministry. Tonks leaned against the fountain, yawning. Seeing him, she straightened and shook the bulging document bag in her hand. Afternoon, Lynn. Afternoon, Tonks. Lynn took the bag and peeked inside. There was a lot. A new passport embossed with the International Confederation of Wizards emblem, a transit certification stamped several times, a Hogwarts enrollment certificate, odd for travel to the U.S., a wand registration document, a magical items declaration form, even a visa. Lynn stared at that last slip of paper in surprise. The wizarding world actually issues visas? Tonks blinked. Is there a problem? No, no problem. He hadn't expected the ministry to be so procedural. That's good. You can set off using the Flu Network now, Tonks said. Lynn was about to leave when she added, One more thing. She pointed at the folder. That wand permit needs to be activated at the Magical Congress of the United States. He fished a crumpled form from the bottom labeled Wand Use Permit Application Form. It had to be processed at a designated location after entry. Lynn's lip twitched. Troublesome. Tonks shrugged. Rules. He shoved the form back in and waved. Thanks. Safe travels. When Lynn stepped out of the flue fireplace at the Magical Congress of the United States, he was nearly blinded. The lobby was far grander than he'd imagined. A dome so high its peak escaped view, chandeliers as enormous as Hogwarts's hung from above, and the dark marble floor shone like glass. Huge moving portraits decorated the walls. A portrait in a stars and stripes robe, giving an impassioned speech, while the audience below clapped in a loop. The air smelled of coffee, rather than the old musty scent of the British ministry. There was no time to admire the architecture. As soon as he emerged, a Congress official blocked his path. The man was tall, wearing a deep blue uniform with a golden badge. "Sir, please show identification." Lynn handed over the documents. "Oh." The official flipped through them. "Passport, fine. Transit certification, fine. Enrollment certificate, fine." He lingered when he came to the wand registration. "Laurel, dragon heartstring 13.5 inches? Correct. And the spare wand?" Lynn almost asked which one then, remembering this was abroad, pulled the spare from his sleeve and handed it over. The official examined it. "Ash, phoenix feather, 11 inches? Correct." He recorded the details and, glancing down, spotted Lynn's leather suitcase. His gaze paused. "Sir, the contents of the suitcase need to be inspected." Lynn raised an eyebrow. "Was that always required?" "Sorry, sir. It hasn't been, but since Mr. Scamander's arrival, the Congress has temporarily added this item." "Of course, Newt Scamander." Lynn handed over the battered suitcase and silently mouthed "disagree" as the official opened it. Inside were neatly folded clothes, 2 books, and a bag of cookies. The inspector rummaged through the garments, checking pockets, flipped through the books, and finally examined the cookies. "What's this?" "Cookies," Lynn said. "Homemade." The official closed the case and returned it. "No problem, sir. Your documents are activated. Enjoy your time in the United States." Lynn took the suitcase and stepped out into the city. American streets were broader than Britain's. Stiff sunlight beat down from an unclouded sky. Glass-faced skyscrapers threw back blinding reflections. Cars threaded the avenues, horns blaring. The air carried that peculiar mix of exhaust and perfume. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Edgar. What did the principal want with you?" "I'm still by the Statue of Liberty. Want to meet?" Lynn replied, "I've arrived." A few seconds later, Edgar sent a location. Then, "You didn't smuggle yourself in, did you?" Lynn, official channels. "Here to help Mr. Scamander find something." Silence followed. After a while, "Do you need my help?" "Most likely not," Lynn answered. The exchange ended. Suddenly, a flutter of wings overhead. An owl, unsteady in flight, came swooping down with a craft paper envelope clutched in its talons. It landed on Lynn's shoulder, nudged the letter into his hand, then fluttered away into the canopy of a nearby tree. Lynn tore the envelope open. Inside was a scrap of paper, handwriting as messy as chicken scratch. "Central Park. Ask a passerby if you can't find it. Newt S." That saved him a call to the old principal. At Central Park, Lynn found Newt hiding behind a large tree, half his head peeking over the rim of a battered suitcase. Newt's suit was speckled with leaves and grass, his hair a disheveled mess. The leather case sat on the ground beside him, faint rustling coming from within. People passed the paths, joggers, dog walkers, parents with strollers, but for some reason they all gave this spot a wide berth. A silver blur flashed through the trees opposite. It moved like a fish through water, darting between branches. The creature had silvery fur and a vaguely simian appearance. It paused on a branch, tilted its head, and stared with huge, curious eyes before melting away into the sunlight. Near Newt, a neat pile of fruit, apples, bananas, grapes, sat waiting. A cluster of grapes wobbled into the air, and a few were plucked. Newt's face lit up. He reached into his sleeve for his wand. A soft beam of light arced silently toward the fruit. A startled cry came from the air. With a flick of his wand, the suitcase lid popped open. A burst of indignant chattering spilled out as the lid closed again. Newt exhaled, shoulders sagging. He patted the case lid like someone soothing an anxious child, brushing off a little dust. Only then did Lynn step closer. "Good afternoon, Mr. Scamander." Newt turned. He was as awkward as ever, coat streaked with foliage, hair untidy. "That was a—" Lynn gestured to the case. "A demiguise?" Newt nodded. Then he fell silent, studying Lynn as if waiting for him to take the next step. Lynn returned the look, both men hanging in the awkward pause that always followed Newt's shyness. Silence stretched between them. Newt stood with his gaze drifting back to the 16 from time to time, clearly still worrying about those escaped little ones. Lynn waited beside him, feeling that if he didn't speak up, Newt might simply turn and continue searching for the three. "Mr. Scamander," Lynn said, "have you eaten?" Newt paused, looked up as if seriously considering it, and after a few seconds lowered his head and admitted, sheepish, "I forgot." It made sense. When this old gentleman got lost in the chase of three, he could forget food as easily as anything else. Newt produced his 19 and messaged Edgar, "Help me book a restaurant." A few seconds later, Edgar replied, "Are you putting a future star of the Department of International Magical Cooperation to work for you?" Even through the text, Lynn could picture Edgar's smug expression. "Say if you can't do it." Edgar instantly shot back. "Lecoq Rico. My parents go there when they visit the States. French-Italian fusion, nice atmosphere." Lynn slid his 19 away and suggested, "Mr. Scamander, let's eat first. You'll need strength to work." Newt hesitated, glanced down at the 16 by his feet. Lynn braced to cajole him, but Newt nodded, murmured a soft "okay," bent to pick up the 16, and fell into step. He truly had the soft, steady patience of a Hufflepuff, dropout or not. Lecoq Rico sounded familiar. Lynn realized they'd passed it on the east side of Central Park. When they reached the restaurant, Edgar was already there, in a new, well-cut suit with a small United States Ministry of Magic visitor badge pinned to his chest, leaning against a pillar and playing with his 19. He stuffed the phone in his pocket at their approach and gave them a bright grin. "So fast? Weren't you at the Statue of Liberty? How did you get here before us?" Edgar produced an old copper key from his pocket, dull, worn, a line of tiny words etched into the handle. Lynn squinted. "Lecoq Rico, private," it read. "My parents prepared this portkey for me so I can get a meal conveniently," Edgar said, tossing the key in his hand with obvious pride. Lynn went quiet. He'd spent half a day getting a passport, running to the ministry and filling out permits to come to the U.S. Edgar had his own portkey for dining. "Let's go," Edgar said, pushing the door and making an exaggerated after-you gesture. "I booked a private room." They followed a waiter down a corridor of dark wood floors and impressionist paintings, the lighting warm, the air scented with butter and spices. The private room at the end was snug and quiet, with a window facing Central Park. Edgar flipped through the menu like he'd read it a dozen times. Duck confit, ratatouille, lobster bisque, creme brulee, rattling dishes off in one breath. Newt glanced and ordered only a vegetable soup. Lynn picked a few things at random. While they waited, Edgar, clearly bursting with curiosity, leaned forward. "Mr. Scamander," he lowered his voice, "how many more 3 do you have out there?" Newt thought a moment, his fingers tapping the table as if counting. "About 7 or 8. Lynn let out a long breath. He felt overwhelmed just thinking of the few cramped into his own 16. 7 or 8, escaped from the Ghost 16, he didn't want to imagine how many were still inside. "If they're all babies," he said softly, "it shouldn't be too bad." Newt's ears twitched at the tone, and he shook his head. "Not all of them." Then Newt began listing names quietly, and each one landed like a small explosion. "Nundu," Lynn's eyelid twitched. "An XXXXX class creature capable of wiping out a village with a single toxic breath, deadly even as a baby. Akami, an XXX class creature capable of expanding or shrinking to fit any space. Finding one was like hunting for a needle in a haystack. Runespore, another XXXX class, 3-headed. One plans, one has venom, one daydreams, and they run faster than rabbits. Erumpent," Newt went on. Lynn's face grew darker with each name. Each creature was rated XXXX or worse, each harder to catch than the last. "There might be more I haven't identified yet. I'll have to check the 16 to see who's missing." Newt tried to reassure him, but it shouldn't take too long. They all have fixed ranges and habits. Once we find the pattern... Oh, right, and an obscurus. Lynn swore his hearing had failed. An obscurus? Weren't obscurials supposed to have vanished ages ago? The book said they were gone. The 20s said so. Even Dumbledore had noted their disappearance at the beginning of the last century. Obscuruses couldn't survive without a host. How had Newt got one? Edgar sat frozen with a piece of duck on his fork, mouth forming an O. He clearly knew how terrifying an obscurus could be. The private room fell silent. Before Lynn could voice another question, the ground began to rumble. The sound came from a distance, growing louder, closer. They looked up at once, exchanged a quick glance, and then a chorus of terrified screams rose from outside. Where did this rhino come from? Help! Call the police! Call the police! Fire! Open fire! Lynn dropped his cutlery and bolted. Newt followed with surprising speed for a man his age. Edgar, after a beat, grabbed the unfinished bread and ran after them. Outside, the street was chaos. Cars were haphazardly parked, some smashed together, others mounted on sidewalks. Trash cans lay overturned, garbage strewn in the wind. Lampposts leaned, wires dangled and sparked. And in the middle of the road, a massive erumpent was rampaging. It wasn't a juvenile. This was a full-grown adult. Its hide was thick and gray like armor, and its single horn shone metallic in the sunlight. The creature was ramming a taxi, pushing it sideways until it drove into a lamppost. The post snapped with a metallic crash. Muggles, nomads in the United States, nearby had taken out guns. Bullets pinged off the erumpent's hide like tin on a drum, sending up sparks but doing nothing else. Irritated, the erumpent pawed the ground and prepared to charge the crowd. Lynn and Newt moved instinctively. I'll subdue the erumpent, Newt said, already charging forward. You deal with the Muggles. Newt covered ground in an instant and stood at the center of the street, 27 in hand, its tip glowing faintly. Lynn moved almost as fast. His own, 27, slid from his sleeve, spun once in his palm, the tip pointing at the densest cluster of people, where several men were firing in bursts. Lynn fired a single spell, Confringo. A concussive blast detonated across the street, shuttering car windows and drowning the gunfire. The explosion startled the crowd into silence. Even the erumpent paused and turned. Dozens of heads swung toward Lynn. Now, with the crowd's attention captured, Lynn's 27 glowed silvery white. He spoke calmly. Look this way. A ripple of light fanned out from the wand's tip. The people became rooted, staring at the wand as if it were the most fascinating thing they'd ever seen. Gunmen lowered their weapons. Passers-by stopped mid-step. A homeless man peered from behind a trash can with a dazed expression. The street fell still. That's a rhino, Lynn said, voice steady. A rhino that escaped from the zoo. A woman murmured agreement. A rhino, another echoed, voice sleepy. Yes, a rhino. You were just passing by, saw a rhino, thought it odd, watched it for a moment, and then went on your way. Heads nodded. Someone rubbed sleep from their eyes and yawned as if waking. Another looked down at the gun in his hand, puzzled, and slipped it back into his pocket. Confusion flickered over faces. What was I doing with this? Lynn knew hypnosis alone wouldn't be enough for long. People would snap out of it and see the erumpent again. He flicked his 27 once more and cast a wide-range Muggle-repelling charm that wrapped the entire block, shielding their actions from Nomad's notice and giving them time to deal with the beast. While Lynn was dealing with the Muggles, Newt's efforts to soothe the erumpent continued. Facing a creature clearly on the verge of rage, Newt dared not use magic to restrain it directly. The erumpent's hide was thick and tough. A stupefy would be little more than an annoyance. If it missed or failed, it might only provoke the beast further. He spread his hands, palms outward, and edged closer with slow, careful steps, planting each foot deliberately to avoid making noise. The erumpent turned its head and fixed its enormous, bloodshot eyes on him. Its nostrils flared with heavy breaths, and its front hooves pawed at the ground restlessly. Still, it did not charge. It's all right, Newt said quietly. No one is going to hurt you. Calm down, okay? The beast's pawing slowed. Its gaze shifted from vigilance to bewilderment, then to hesitation. Newt took another small step. His hand almost touched the erumpent's rough hide. This was Newt. If it had been anyone else, the creature would already have lashed out. Just as he thought he had settled it, a nearby utility pole that had been wobbling after the erumpent's earlier collision let out a piercing groan and toppled straight toward the animal. The pole smashed into the erumpent with a thunderous crack, shattering in two. Debris flew, wires crackled, and sparks showered everywhere. Newt's hand froze midair. He stared from the broken pole to the sparking wire to the erumpent, which had relaxed a moment ago and was now slowly turning its head. Newt swallowed hard and then ran. The erumpent roared, struck off the ground with its hind legs, and charged with its single horn aimed at Newt's back. Newt ran like a man with nothing to lose, his greatcoat flapping behind him. For the moment, he was anything but an old man. People could do remarkable things when pushed to the limit, except math problems. Those remained stubbornly beyond him. Lynn, returning after erasing the muggle's memories, rounded the corner and found Newt being chased across the street by a massive gray beast. The sight was equal parts alarming and absurd. Newt's hat was gone, his hair stuck up from the wind, his coat billowing, and the erumpent relentlessly closing the distance. Lynn had always believed in action over words when it came to aggressive creatures. Soothing and slow approaches were Newt's specialty. Lynn preferred a more direct solution. He flicked his wand. The phantom of a Graphorn leapt into being beside him, grayish-purple skin, thick hide, two enormous curving horns. Even as a phantom, its presence was imposing. The Graphorn phantom lowered its head and charged. "Oi, you big dummy!" Lynn shouted. The erumpent paused, saw the charging apparition, and met it head-on. Their skulls collided with a heavy, numbing thud. The erumpent was shoved sideways, legs leaving furrows in the pavement, its vision momentarily starry. The phantom wavered at the impact, its edges flickering, but it rallied and charged again. Then, without warning, light crawled up the erumpent's horn. A viscous jet of explosive fluid squirted from the tip and splashed into the phantom's body. The liquid seeped along its gray-purple form, and with a thunderous boom, the Graphorn disintegrated into a scatter of motes that fizzled out like spent fireworks. Newt seized the opening. He raised his wand and sent a binding spell toward the erumpent's front legs. The creature, half-turned, was slowed and caught off balance. Newt cast twice more, one snaring the hind legs, another fastening around the horn. The erumpent's movements grew sluggish, as if wading through invisible tar. It tossed its head, straining, but the bindings only constricted with the effort. Sweat slicked Newt's brow. His arm trembled, but his hand remained steady as he held the light at his wand's tip fixed on the beast. "Lynn!" he called. Lynn stepped forward, wand raised, a crackling ball of blue-white energy forming at the tip. Without hesitation, he released it. Lightning struck the ground beside the erumpent with a deafening explosion. The blast rocked the street, carving a crater and sending stones and sparks scattering. Taking advantage of the chaos, Newt tightened his bindings until the erumpent could barely move. "Now!" he shouted. Lynn's wand flared again, but this time not with lightning. A thick jet of water hissed from the tip and slammed into the creature with driving force. The erumpent lurched backwards. With the bindings still holding it, it could not find purchase. Its hind legs gave way, and it began to tilt. Quickly, Newt looped a magical chain around its neck to steady its balance. "Left!" he barked. Lynn adjusted the direction of the water by the slightest margin, letting the current brush the erumpent's flank. The momentum pushed it to the left, and stepping awkwardly, it stumbled into the crater Lynn's lightning had blasted. It toppled forward and fell into a heavy net Newt had prepared. "Close it," Newt ordered. Lynn snapped his wand, and the water vanished. He planted it toward the ground beneath the net. A flash sank into the earth, and the net cinched tight, pinning the erumpent's legs to the pavement. The beast thrashed a few times, then exhausted, its breath slowing. Newt let out a long, shaky sigh and lowered his wand. His arm ached and his fingers trembled, but he stepped forward anyway. "It's all right," he murmured as he rested a hand on its flank. "No one is going to hurt you. I'm sorry. I must have frightened you." The erumpent's breathing evened out. The light on its horn faded, and it bowed its head, nuzzling into Newt like a worried animal seeking comfort. Edgar, who had been hiding behind a car watching, finally crept out when the fighting was clearly over. He walked over and handed Newt a large case. "I brought it for you," he said. Newt accepted the case, thanked him, and knelt to open it. The erumpent hesitated, watching the open box, and then Newt, eyes full of reluctance. Newt patted its neck and murmured softly. Only then did the animal step forward and set its forehooves into the crate. Newt waited until its entire bulk was inside, gently closed the lid, and snapped the latches securely. He lifted the case and started to turn away. A series of soft cracks sounded nearby. Lynn grabbed Edgar's arm, and in an instant, both of them were lifted off the ground. A dozen aurors, fully armed and in deep blue uniforms with gold badges, blinked into existence around where Newt had been standing. Their wands were trained squarely on him. One of the lead aurors stepped forward. "Mr. Scamander," he intoned, "you are suspected of violating the statute of secrecy. Please come with us to the Magical Congress." Newt said nothing. The aurors closed in, someone took the case, others flanked him, and with another snap, the group vanished, leaving the street eerily quiet. Suspended midair, Lynn and Edgar swung slightly in the breeze, their robes flapping. They stared at the empty space where Newt had stood. No one spoke for a long beat. "Should I call my parents to bail him out?" Edgar asked at last. Lynn thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, let's leave that headache to the principal." He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Dumbledore. The line rang a long time before the headmaster answered. His voice sounded weary, with the soft rustle of turning pages in the background. "Mr. Lynn, has something gone wrong?" "Not too badly, Principal," Lynn said. "Mr. Scamander's been taken by the American Aurors. Could you help get him back?" There was a pause. Then Dumbledore sighed, a tired, long-suffering sound. "Leave it to me." Chapter 306, Proper Transformation. The Magical Congress of the United States of America. Lynn never expected he'd be back here again after being gone for less than half a day. The lobby was exactly the same, its dome so high the top was out of sight, chandeliers still dazzling, and the marble floor polished to a mirror shine. A portrait on the wall, wearing a robe patterned like the Star-Spangled Banner, was still giving a speech, spittle flecking from his mouth, while the crowd in the painting below applauded on endless loop. Fortunately, he hadn't been brought in on suspicion of breaking the law. When the Aurors took Newt away, they hadn't noticed where Lynn went. He'd come under the pretense of being the accused man's student. At the reception desk, a witch asked what his relationship to Mr. Scamander was. Lynn hesitated for a moment, then said, "Student." The witch, apparently not surprised that a man of Newt's age might have a young student, processed the visitation paperwork. In a small meeting room, Lynn and Newt sat opposite each other, separated by a thick sheet of magical glass. It looked like ordinary glass, but when Lynn tried to probe it with his wand, an invisible force repelled his hand. An Auror stood behind Newt, hands folded behind his back, expressionless, eyes fixed on Newt so he couldn't slip away. The stance made Newt look like a dangerous felon, but he sat properly with his hands on the table, the air of a student waiting for a teacher to hand out test papers, not a convict. Lynn glanced from the Auror to Newt, cleared his throat, and said, "Teacher?" His voice was quiet but clear in the small room. Newt looked up. Lynn forced a solemn tone. "Just focus on reforming while you're in there," he said. "You can trust me to handle our research project." Newt blinked, completely confused. What teacher? What reforming? What research project? He opened his mouth to ask, but Lynn's gaze pinned him and Newt shut his mouth again. The Auror's face never changed, but his eyes flickered. He'd heard Lynn's words and was wondering too. Newt wasn't stupid, just socially awkward. He blinked and waited to see what Lynn meant. Seeing Newt still puzzled, Lynn clarified, "Teacher, I'm not sure which locations you intended to research for those runespore projects." He emphasized the word runespore. Newt's eyes widened with understanding. Lynn was talking about the escaped magical creatures. Newt thought a moment. "Oh, I plan to research New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Stamford, and Kingston." Lynn's eyes almost popped out of his head. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Stamford, Kingston. 5 cities, not 5 blocks. That's at least 100 kilometers from New York to Philadelphia. Boston was even further. Stamford was in Connecticut. Kingston, upstate New York. The places were spread across the Northeast. Why so many places? Lynn found himself asking, his voice higher than he intended. Newt spread his hands helplessly. He hadn't noticed while hunting a thunderbird, his suitcase had been left unlatched. He'd chased the thunderbird high into the sky, eventually calming it and returning to the ground, only to find the suitcase lid cracked. The creatures had crept out one by one while he was in the air. The runespore slithered slowly and was probably still nearby. The alchemy could expand and shrink and might have squeezed into some crevice. The Nundu could run fast and might have left the city. The Erumpent had been found, but there was still another creature unaccounted for. Newt opened his mouth to tell Lynn, then swallowed the words when he glanced at the watchful Auror. He only looked at Lynn with a pleading expression. Lynn took a breath and let it out slowly. Fine. New York's fine. Philadelphia's fine. Boston's fine. What else was there to do during the holidays? Newt visibly relaxed, shoulders slumping as if a heavy weight had been lifted. He leaned back and, as if remembering something, pulled an object from his pocket and put it on the table. A moment later, the item was transported outside. Lynn finally saw clearly what it was, a small compass. Its needle didn't point north. It trembled as if tracking something. "Take this," Newt said. "It'll help you find them. Each one is different. It points to the nearest." Lynn took the compass, tucked it into his pocket, stood, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he looked back at Newt, who sat very still. "Teacher," he said, "reform well." Newt gave him a small, grateful smile and shook his head. Lynn pushed the door open and left. Behind him, the Auror watched Newt, then glanced at the closed door, and finally couldn't help asking, "Is that really your student?" Newt met the Auror's eyes and thought, how could he not be at a time like this? "Yes," he answered. Outside the magical congress, Lynn pulled the compass from his pocket. The needle still trembled. After a moment, it steadied and pointed north. Lynn ran a quick mental map of the United States. North should be Kingston, upstate New York, following the Hudson, about a 2-hour drive. Not close for a muggle, but for him. He shoved the compass back in his pocket, and his wand slid out from his sleeve. He stepped back to the edge of the building's steps, looked left and right. People passed without noticing the young man at the department's entrance. He bent his knees and launched himself. With a crack of air, a sonic boom that rattled a nearby trash can, he was gone. Passers-by glanced up and saw only a falling leaf and a plane far overhead. 6 minutes later, Lynn emerged from a deserted alley. He checked the compass again. The needle still pointed north, but now it trembled more strongly. That meant a magical creature was indeed in the area. The compass only gave a general direction, not an exact spot. If he walked too far, the needle would angle and he'd know he'd gone past it, so he paced back and forth through the block like a headless fly. Complaints aside, the job had to be done. Newt was still stuck in the Congress, and there were still creatures missing from his suitcase. Lynn couldn't go back empty-handed. He began a detailed search, checking every shop along the street. Cafe, nothing. Bakery, nothing. Flower shop, nothing. Bookstore, nothing. He turned into an alley where moss grew in the corners and the air smelled faintly of fermentation. The compass needle jumped, thankfully, not here. A few minutes later, Lynn stood at another intersection. The needle stubbornly pointed north. He looked up and found the source, a shop with lace, silk, and ribbons, a lingerie store. Lynn stopped. He glanced down at the compass, then back at the window display of delicate pink and black pieces trimmed with lace. He took a breath, shoved the compass back into his pocket, and pushed open the door. The bell chimed. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman peered out with a practiced smile. "Welcome. Can I help you find something?" "Just looking," Lynn said. He let his eyes scan the shelves, over the satin and lace, until they landed on a display rack in the corner. Behind it, in a narrow gap, a silver ball was curled up like a crumpled scrap of silk. It was a small akami, shimmering with moonlit silver. It had shrunk into the size of a fist and seemed to tremble when it sensed someone watching. Lynn moved closer and reached out toward the silver bundle. "Sir?" the woman asked suddenly. Lynn's hand froze. "Do you need help?" "No." He withdrew his hand and forced a natural smile. "I'm just looking." The woman nodded, but stayed where she was. Lynn waited for her to go back to the counter, but she didn't. Waiting a bit longer, he had no choice but to resume pretending to study the fabric. Pure silk, very smooth. Synthetic, a bit coarser, while his peripheral vision stayed fixed on the akami. It had woken. It stretched, expanding from fist-sized to palm-sized, then to the thickness of an arm. It peeked out, looking left and right, and then slithered up the display pillar like a silver bolt. Lynn's hand was faster. He grabbed the akami's tail. The creature shrieked and violently puffed up, swelling from arm thick to the size of a bucket in the blink of an eye. Its tail thrashed wildly, nearly slipping from his grip. Lynn wrapped both hands around the slippery tail and hauled it down from the rack. The akami swung its head around, its small face furious as it tried to bite his hand. Lynn flicked his wand. The creature's struggle instantly slowed, and it began to shrink back down from bucket size to arm thick. He produced a small cloth bag specifically designed for holding tiny magical creatures, opened it, and stuffed the alchemy inside. It flopped and then went still. The whole thing took a few seconds. When Lynn turned, the woman behind the counter was watching him with an expression that was hard to read. They stared at each other for a beat. "Are you," she began hesitantly, "buying something for your girlfriend?" "Something like that," Lynn said, moving to a shelf and picking up a black lace item at random. He didn't really know what it was, but it looked expensive. He placed it on the counter, paid, took the bag, and left. Every movement was smooth and practiced. Outside, he took a deep breath. From inside, the woman called out again, this time in a tone full of opinion. "Such a handsome young man. What a pity he's gay." Lynn's face hardened. "Obliviate," he snapped, flicking his wand. The memory charm hit the woman like a soft, erasing wind. She blinked and then smiled like nothing had happened, unable to remember the moment that had provoked such an opinion. Lynn walked away, the alchemy snug in its bag at his side, the compass warm in his pocket, and the day still far from over. Chapter 307. I Want to Go to Magic School. Over the next few days, Lynn learned what it meant to scour the heavens and the earth, and what it meant to play persistent hide-and-seek with magical beasts. On the first day, he caught a swooping evil in the clouds. It had been hiding in a bank of mist, and he had to chase several before he finally plucked one free. On the second day, he hauled a rune spore out from beneath Central Park. Its 3 heads were stubborn as anything, and it took ages to get it under control. On the third day, he tracked a nundu all the way into the New Jersey suburbs. It was shockingly fast. He ran so much his legs felt like they were turning to water. On the fourth day, he hauled a grindalow out of the Hudson and spent an entire afternoon dripping and shivering until his skin began to prune. There were also hippogriffs, kappas, pygmy puffs, quintupeds. Far more than the 7 or 8 Newt had admitted. Newt had lost at least twice as many beasts as he'd said. Lynn swore as he searched. Then, once he'd finished swearing, he went right back to searching. He had scoured for days, traveled all over, and caught creature after creature. But the one particular beast Newt had mentioned, Lynn still hadn't seen it. Worse, even the compass Newt had given him wouldn't pick up its location. The needle just hung there, motionless, pointing in one direction like a broken toy. Could it have dissipated after escaping Newt's suitcase? Lynn wondered as he walked the streets of New York. He turned the compass over and over. With his level of alchemy, he was sure it wasn't busted. Out of habit, he tried the only repair method he'd ever really trusted. He gave it a good, authoritative smack. Still nothing. Left with no choice, he had to keep looking. Ding dong. A notification chimed. Lynn pulled out his phone. "I've finished my advanced management training at Makusa, and I'm heading home. Want to come with us?" Lynn typed back. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. You go ahead. I'm still missing one thing." "Then stay safe." A second message popped up immediately. "What I mean is, make sure everyone else stays safe. I don't want to have to bail you out of prison." Lynn stared at the screen and felt a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Get lost." Edgar sent back a middle finger emoji. Conversation over. Lynn slipped his phone away and kept wandering the city. On the other side, after messaging Lynn, Edgar put his phone away and went back to his parents. "Lynn said he's not coming back with us. He still has things to do." Edward nodded, a touch of pride in his voice. "It's normal to be busy. With such achievements at such a young age, champion of the alchemy competition and the youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin, first class, anyone would be busy." Edgar curled his lip inward. If his father knew just how much trouble Lynn could cause, he wouldn't be talking about achievements. He'd be talking about a criminal record. He changed the subject. "Mom, are we going back through the Flu network or using a port key?" Anna looked briefly uncomfortable and nudged her husband with her eyes. Edward cleared his throat. "This time we're taking a Muggle airplane." Edgar blinked. "An airplane?" "Yes." "Why?" He wasn't opposed, it just seemed roundabout. Edward gave him a look that suggested experience. "There's still some money left in the ministry budget." Edgar waited for the rest. "Budget approvals are one thing. actual spending another, and what's reported spent is yet another. Edward said carefully. In short, there can be a surplus, but not too much. You can save a little, but not enough to raise eyebrows. Edgar glanced at his father's meaningful expression and his mother's don't ask face and suddenly realized the ministry's ledgers were probably far more convoluted than he'd imagined. Anna clapped her hands. All right, it's time to head to the airport. JFK International. The terminal was huge. Edgar looked around instinctively. Lots of people, he observed. It is an international airport, Edward replied, and they moved through the queues, checked in, and dropped off their luggage. Edgar grumbled about the hassle. The airplane seats were softer than train benches, but not exactly comfortable. He adjusted himself and picked up the in-flight magazine from the seat pocket in front of him. Glossy, duty-free adverts filled the pages. At the back was a route map showing a curved line from New York to London with the flight time and distance, another 7 or 8 hours. Edgar felt taking the plane was unnecessary, but the decision had been made. He leaned back and watched the clouds slide by, a vast, unchanging white that made his eyes ache after a while. He pulled an eye mask from his pocket. Lynn had given it to him as a long-distance travel essential. He'd thought it looked silly at first, but silly or not, sleep trumps vanity. He put it on and let the hum of the engines fill his senses. The plane hit a few bumps, and the seat swayed. Half asleep, he heard the captain's announcement. Hello, passengers. This is your captain speaking. This is the final flight of my career. Thank you all for your company over the years, and I wish you a pleasant journey. The broadcast ended with a click. Around him, whispers spread. Final flight, someone mused. The captain must be retiring, another said. A man's voice a few rows back bubbled with excitement. Look, this is my fiancée of 10 years, he said with a proud chuckle. I'm finally going home to marry her. Edgar drifted further into that liminal space between awake and asleep as more conversations knocked against his eardrums. I won the lottery, a voice declared in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. I've been buying tickets forever. I finally won. How much? Someone asked. Not a small amount, the winner said, unable to hide the smile in his voice. Voices came and went. Then a child's voice cut through with urgent sobs. Mom, I don't want to go abroad. I want to go to Ilvermorny. I want to. What a wizarding school, a woman snapped, exasperation thick in her voice. That's all a lie. Edgar's mouth twitched beneath the eye mask. He almost laughed out loud. The child was crying now. It's not a lie. It's real. You're lying. It's a scam, the woman snapped, tone rising. There's no such thing as Ilvermorny School. Those letters are fake. They're just trying to trick you. Now settle down. After the woman's roar, a brief silence fell over the plane. Then the sobbing began. At first it was intermittent, as if something were stuck in the child's throat. Then it could no longer be suppressed. It swelled and broke into a wail. The child cried so heart-rendingly he was nearly incoherent, between sobs shouting, You're lying! You're lying! Edgar felt as if the crying was right in his ear, grinding into his skull. He couldn't sleep for it. He shoved his eye mask into his pocket and sat up, determined to watch. Many others had the same idea. Passengers in the front rows were already craning to look back. The child's sobs intensified, his whole face flushed bright red, streaked with tears and mucus. His mother stood helpless beside him, reaching out, only to be pushed away. Edgar barely registered the slight tremor that ran through the fuselage until it happened again. Harder, the cup of cola in the holder quivered. Edward beside him snapped upright. What? Before Edgar could answer, a terrible grinding sound came from outside the window. It was hard to describe, metal scraping, a sudden seizure, an abnormal clatter. The fuselage jolted violently and the whole cabin listed to the right. Edgar grabbed the armrest and turned his head. On the right wing, those two things William had once explained were called engines. One of them had stopped spinning. The fan blades were motionless. Several faint cracks spidered across the outer casing. Edgar's heart dropped. Dad, what's going on? Edward stared at the stalled engine, lips twitching. He had been a ministry official for years, had handled all kinds of magical accidents and written countless reports, but never anything like this. An airliner at several thousand meters losing an engine because of a child's outburst of magic. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. It was the same voice, but it sounded brittle now. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have encountered a technical issue with the right engine, and it has been shut down as a precaution. The aircraft is flying normally on the remaining 3 engines, and the situation is under control. Please remain seated, keep your seatbelts fastened, and follow the instructions of the cabin crew. Thank you for your cooperation. The cabin held its breath for a couple of seconds, then erupted. People screamed and cried. Some stood to grab luggage and were sternly ordered back down. The man who had said he was going home to get married turned ghostly pale, clutching a photo of his fiancée as if it might dissolve. The man who had boasted about winning the lottery huddled in his seat, lips trembling. But the panic was short-lived. The plane was still flying steadily. The clouds outside were lazy, and sunlight still slanted golden through them. If not for the dead engine bolted to the right wing, it might have seemed as if nothing had happened. Passengers gradually quieted. Flight attendants paced the aisles, voices shaking as they repeated, "Please remain seated. Fasten your seatbelts. Do not panic." Edgar leaned back, trying to slow his heart. He drew a deep breath and was about to say something to Edward when he saw it. A mass of black mist forming in the clouds outside. It had no fixed shape, like a crumpled blot of ink rolling and writhing at the edge of the cloud layer. Its edges curled and crumbled like charred paper, yet it seemed to regenerate as it shifted. The black mass lingered outside the window only a heartbeat, as if studying the plane, then moved. Without sound, without warning, it passed through the fuselage like a hand through water. Not a single rivet or metal fragment flew. The hull remained intact, but the black mist was inside the cabin in an instant, hovering above the aisle like a giant ink-dark jellyfish. Tendrils of shadow spread outward. Screams rose anew. "What is that? Help! A ghost! God save us!" Passengers scattered. Some bolted down the aisle, some huddled together, some pressed themselves to the floor and covered their heads. Luggage slid from the overhead bins and clattered onto seats. The black mist ignored the chaos. It drifted, seemingly searching, then contracted like a squeezed wad of cotton until it was the size of a fist. In one swift motion, it darted into the child. The wailing stopped mid-sob. The boy froze, sitting bolt upright, eyes wide but dead, his pupils flat, empty as if something had hollowed him out. Dark patterns began to crawl beneath his skin, starting at his wrists and snaking up his forearms, meeting at his throat, branching across his cheeks and along his temples. Then, impossibly, he lifted up off his seat. Passengers descended into total panic. Some crouched on the floor, hands over their heads. Others thudded on the windows. A few grabbed life jackets and fumbled them on. Edward sprang up, his right hand plunging into his suit's inner pocket. Beside him, Anna was even faster. "Stupefy!" she cried, her wand snatching the air. The spell flew from the tip of her wand, through the black mist and the boy's floating body, struck the cabin ceiling, bounced once, and dissipated. It had missed, or more precisely, it had hit and achieved nothing. The black mist only rippled, like a wind across water, and settled again. The boy still hovered, the dark veins under his skin deepening as if something alive was moving through them. Edward's face went pale. "It's an obscurus." "Aye." Edgar barely registered the word. Edward's wand was already leveled at the shadow. Anna didn't hesitate. She flicked and sent another spell. "Flipendo." This hit the edge of the black mass. The thing contracted as if seared and peeled away from the boy for a fraction of a second. The child's body dropped half a meter before the mist snapped back around him, tighter than before. He cried out. Anna's jaw set. "It's assimilating the boy's magic," she said. "The child's becoming an obscurial. No, he nearly is." Edward and Anna acted together without speaking. No discussion, not a second's hesitation. Stupefy. Anna's spell carved a bright streak through the cramped cabin. Passengers continued to scream. To them, this light seemed like something they could not see. But the black mist noticed. The patterns under the boy's skin flared, and a translucent black barrier shimmered into being in front of him. The Stupefy struck that barrier and vanished soundlessly. At the same time, Edward's wand was already in motion. He sent forth a second spell. Silver-white chains burst from the tip of his wand, unfurling through the air toward the boy. The mist reacted, separating a tendril like a probing tentacle. The chain hesitated, and then reversed, shooting back at Edward with terrifying speed. Edward's pupils narrowed. Anna flung up a shield charm in time, throwing a protective barrier around the three of them. The black mist was provoked. It didn't send another tendril. It moved as a whole, expanding in an instant from fist-sized to bucket-sized and swallowing the child. The dark patterns beneath his skin streamed out and into the mist, like countless thin snakes slipping through tissue. The mist smudged against the shield charm like acid, hissing. "Reinforce it," Edward shouted. Anna poured her magic into the shield, and it brightened, pushing the darkness back a few inches. But the gain held for less than 2 seconds. The mist contracted, and then, just as it had done penetrating the hull, flowed through the shield silently, with no resistance. The barrier still shimmered, but the black mass was already beside them. They could see writhing patterns inside it. Edward retreated half a step, wand raised to speak another counterspell, but before he could find the words, a hand reached out from the black mist and waved almost playfully. Edward's and Anna's wands flew from their grips at the same instant, spinning in the air a few times before dropping into the darkness and vanishing. The two stood empty-handed, expressions frozen in disbelief. Then a pitch-black wand appeared in the child's hand. He raised it and pointed it out the window. A blast of dark red light shot from its tip, pierced the fuselage, and struck the fan blades of the remaining engines. There was no explosion, no flame. The blades simply stopped as if pinched, coming to a motionless halt. In an instant, the plane went into a rapid descent. Chapter 309, Battle over the Atlantic. Edgar sighed and fumbled out his phone, dialing Lynn. Beep. The call was picked up almost immediately. Lynn's voice came back sharp and impatient, with a hint of annoyance at being disturbed. You'd better have a good reason. Edgar scratched his head and stared at the rapidly approaching ocean outside the window. In a half-dead voice, he said, I'm about to crash. There was a 2-second silence on the other end. Then Lynn answered, no longer impatient, just 2 crisp words, location. Over the Atlantic, I don't know the exact. The line cut off mid-sentence. Edgar stared at the screen where call ended, blinked, and froze for a moment. Then a streak of golden red light flared outside the cabin, dropping down from above the clouds so fast it looked like a meteor tearing out of the sky. It pierced the cloud layer, passed the falling plane, and stopped abruptly beneath the fuselage. The light exploded, and from it Wuan emerged, spreading enormous wings. Its tail feathers left trails of golden light like stardust, and each flap scattered warm radiance. The light fell under the falling plane like an invisible palm, supporting the massive body as it hurtled toward the ocean. The descent jerked to a halt. Something invisible held the plane aloft, forcing it to hover over the Atlantic. The clouds outside the window stopped rushing by. Passengers who had been screaming were thrown about by the sudden stop. Some slid from their seats, others hit seatbacks, and many gripped armrests until their knuckles went white. Still, the plane truly hung motionless above the water. Edgar looked up through the window at the dissipating fragments of golden red light and a figure descending from above the clouds. The figure paused in midair, wand in hand, looked down at the plane, and then vanished. The next second, Lynn was inside the cabin. That was fast, Edgar croaked a smile that looked worse than crying. As expected of you. Lynn ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the roiling black mist over the aisle and the child beneath it, his skin veined with crawling black patterns. Without a word, Lynn raised his wand and fired a bolt of lightning. A blue-white arc exploded through the narrow cabin, striking the surface of the black mist before the surrounding passengers could react. The child instinctively swung his own wand. The black mist condensed into a translucent shield in front of him. Boom! The lightning slammed into the shield and burst into blinding white light. The shield convulsed and spidered with cracks, but it held. The shockwave rattled the cabin. Seats shook and luggage tumbled from the overhead bins. Thick smoke billowed from the impact and choked the aisle. Lynn flicked his wand and a gust of wind sprang from its tip, blasting the black mist aside. When the smoke cleared a moment later, a sharp sound rang out, the noise of breaking glass. The child, who had been possessed by the four, smashed through a window and was hurled out. Shards sprayed through the cabin, the pressure dropped, and a rush of wind almost knocked passengers off their feet. Oxygen masks popped down from above, dangling in the aisle. Lynn's eyes went hard, and he shot out after the child. He hovered in the air, tracking the fleeing black figure. In an instant, he caught up. High-altitude wind howled in his ears, and clouds rolled beneath his boots. The black mist trailed a long wake, like a scorched meteor, a dozen meters ahead. Suddenly, the child, no, the entity of the four, whirled around midair. With a flick of its wand, the black mist expanded and contorted, transforming into a hideous giant serpent in one fluid motion. Its body, longer than Durmstrang's great ship, was pure pitch black, scales glinting oddly in sunlight. Its maw opened to reveal rows of black fangs, and a thick black liquid surged up from deep in its throat and spat directly at Lynn. Lynn's pupils narrowed, and he surged upward. The black spit brushed past his boots and splashed into the Atlantic. Instantly, a patch of fish floated belly up at the surface. He steadied himself and pointed his wand downward. A roaring column of water erupted like a dragon and charged at the giant serpent. The serpent did not dodge. It opened its mouth again and spat another jet of black liquid that collided with the water column. Sizzle! The instant the two fluids met, the black liquid crawled up the water like a living thing, racing to the wand tip as if to infect it. Lynn cut the water off without hesitation. With a wrist flick, the column snapped in half, and the top portion fell back into the sea, carrying the black sludge with it. Using the opening, he flashed aside and put distance between them. The serpent twisted midair and lunged. Lynn steadied and waved his wand. Lightning condensed at the tip and split into countless arcs, then stretched and sharpened into dozens of blue-white arrows. They hung, clustered at his side, all aimed at the charging beast. He flicked his wrist, and they fired together. Dozens of streaks of light screamed toward the serpent from all angles. The serpent's tail whipped, sweeping aside and shattering most of the arrows in a spray of sparks. Its scales were harder than plated armor. The arrows bounced off, leaving no more than scratches. The assault did little damage, but inflicted an insult instead. The serpent swatted the last arrows away, turned, and lunged for Lynn again. This time, it found the wand in his hand had changed. In place of the wand, a blade of fiendfire had condensed, an enormous golden-red sword over a person's height. Flames licked its edge, heat warped the air, and tiny embers danced at the hilt with sharp crackles. Lynn seized the blade with both hands and slashed. The serpent couldn't dodge in time. It opened its maw and bit down on the blade. Boom! Fiendfire and black mist collided in a visible shockwave. Sparks flew and black smoke roiled as the sword's edge slammed into the serpent's upper jaw. The beast roared and writhed, tail lashing so hard the wind shredded the clouds, but it didn't release. It clamped its fangs onto the flaming blade and hauled, dragging Lynn toward the earth. Wind screamed past his ears, clouds rushed by, and the ground grew clearer beneath them. Lynn gritted his teeth, muscles straining as thousand refinements poured power into his arms. He grunted, and with everything he had hurled the blade free. The serpent was flung hundreds of meters, tumbling through the air. Its tail swept the sea, sending a wall of water towering up dozens of meters. Lynn steadied himself. The fiendfire blade did not fade. It swelled. Its length doubled, flames running along the edge and painting the clouds golden red. He held the blade with both hands, tip angled down, like a divine statue born of fire. The serpent hesitated, then charged again. Lynn planted his feet. As the beast reached him, he drew the blade in a downward arc from belly to neck. Flames seared a deep trench along its flank. Black scales sheared off and flew in all directions, dissipating into smoke. The serpent was thrown backward again, tumbling into a thick bank of clouds. Lynn gave it no respite. He flicked his wrist, and the fiendfire dispersed outward, converging into a towering inferno that engulfed the tumbling serpent from every side. The flames closed like a giant hand, clutching the black mass. Impact sounds came from inside the fireball. 1, 2, 3, then began to slow. The serpent thrashed until its struggles grew faint. Scales fell away and dissolved into black smoke. When the last scale dropped, the serpent vanished entirely. Where the serpent had been, the child floated curled into a ball, his skin still marked but the black veining much lighter. His eyes were closed, breathing faint, face ashen. Lynn flicked his wand and a binding curse wrapped around him. He hovered closer, ready to try to strip the four from the boy. Then the child screamed, a high, keening wail, his body convulsing before collapsing unconscious. The black markings under his skin flared wildly, like something churning deep inside. Suddenly, a mass of black mist shot out from his chest. The four had peeled itself free. It hovered for a heartbeat, as if considering a direction, then bolted away with incredible speed, covering hundreds of meters in an instant. Lynn flicked his wand and launched an invisible blade in pursuit, but the four paused and then split in midair, as if sliced down the middle. One half continued fleeing, while the other turned and streaked straight for the plane Edgar was on. Lynn's pupils contracted. "Damn it!" he cursed, and without hesitation flipped and chased after the plane. Lynn was in front of the plane in an instant. He hovered there, his 15 raised, the tip aimed at the roiling mass of black mist racing toward the fuselage. Without hesitation, he flicked his wrist. A bolt of lightning as thick as a bucket lanced from the tip of his 15 with a sizzling crackle, striking the black cloud straight on. Lynn had expected it to slam into that shielding layer again, as before. He had even planned his next move. If the lightning were blocked, he would use fiendfire to sever the mist from the plane. If the mist turned away, he would use lightning to seal its retreat. But the bolt hit the mist directly, with no resistance at all. There was a muffled thud. The black mist contracted like a squeezed balloon, collapsing from the size of a bucket to the size of a fist in an instant. Lynn blinked. Fine fissures spidered across the surface of the fist-sized sphere, cracks racing from end to end. It looked as if it was about to detonate. Without thinking, Lynn lashed out with his bifni. Golden-red flames burst from the tip, snaking outward to weave a thick wall of fire in front of him. The flame barrier expanded, curving to protect the plane behind him as well. Just as the barrier sealed, the little black sphere blew up. Boom! Black mist gushed out, spreading like water through a broken dam. It surged and rolled, thick as ink, swallowing the sky. Darkness filled Lynn's vision. The golden-red fire was the only light. The mist smashed against the barrier with a sizzling roar, like ice in boiling oil, evaporating where it hit, but more mist surged behind it, wave after wave. The impact thudded into the barrier. The flames flickered, the wall shuddered, then steadied. Lynn frowned. The force was surprisingly light. Compared to the fight he'd just witnessed, this was barely an appetizer. Something didn't feel right. Why would the force split itself in half and come here only to set off a firework? He doubled his magic output, thickening the barrier, the golden red light flaring and forcing the surrounding black mist back several meters. He waited. Nothing else happened. No second explosion, no sneak attack, just that churning mass, like stirred ink, slowly diluting. Cautiously, Lynn eased the barrier aside and sent a gust from his 510. The wind dispersed the mist and revealed the blue sky, the clouds, the shimmer of the sea. But the fragment of the four gone. Not a wisp remained. Lynn's face went dark. Damn it, I've been played. He ground his teeth. That fist-sized piece had been a decoy, bait to stall him while the other half slipped away. The real threat had already escaped. He took a breath to steady himself. It was too late to give chase. The Atlantic was too vast. He turned to the plane. All four engines had stopped. The blades hung motionless, their casings scored by traces of the black mist's corrosion. Lynn raised his 15. Reparo. White light washed from the tip and wrapped the engine that had failed first. Cracks sealed, blades spun, accelerating to a steady roar. He swept the light to the other engines. One by one, they came back to life. The fuselage shuddered as if a sleeping giant was waking. Lynn stowed his 15 and flew to the hole in the side of the cabin. Wuan stood guard there, wings spread, a hemispherical dome of golden red sealing the breach. Pressure had been restored. Any debris sucked out had long since been ejected. Wuan gave a soft cry and stepped aside as Lynn approached. He stepped into the cabin. Edward and Anna were busy, each holding a 15. Lynn recognized them as Edgar's spare wand that he had given. They were moving down the rows, casting spells on the unconscious passengers. Obliviate. Edward's wand tip touched a forehead. A silvery light sank into the skin. Tension smoothed from the faces, breath evened, fear softened into peaceful sleep. Anna straightened the cabin, stuffing luggage back in, righting tilted seats, collecting scattered magazines. Their motions were efficient, practiced. Edgar sat with nothing to do, hands empty, looking helplessly from one to another. When he saw Lynn carrying the child in, his face brightened. Lynn! He popped up and hurried over, craning to see behind him. Where's the four? Bring it out, I want to see! Lynn's expression soured. He put the unconscious boy on an empty seat and said through clenched teeth, Didn't catch it, it got away. Edgar froze, then, awkward, scratched his head and turned his attention to the child. Is he all right? Lynn sighed, tilted the child's head back and checked pupils and pulse. Breathing steady, heartbeat normal, but his face was frighteningly pale. If nothing goes wrong, Lynn said, withdrawing his hand, his voice mixed, he's become a muggle. A muggle? Edgar echoed. When the four was pulled from his body, it took his magic with it. Lynn sank into the back of a chair and rubbed his temple. There's no trace of magic left in him. He's just like a muggle now. He added, quieter, it's better this way. If the four had stayed, it would have drained him dry in a few years. Edgar had no reply. After a moment, footsteps came from the cockpit. Edward and Anna emerged, sweat beading on their brows, faces still pale. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, then stared at Lynn with a complicated look. Even his own 15 had been taken earlier by that black thing. If Lynn hadn't arrived when he did, this plane might be at the bottom of the Atlantic. And yet Lynn handled it so casually, as if he'd just returned from a walk. The feeling was a mix of gratitude and discomfort, an old nine suddenly realizing a student had outshone him. Then Edward straightened. Mr. Lynn, we owe you our lives. Lynn waved it off. You're too kind. I did what had to be done. Edward recovered and nodded. Yes, thank you. He glanced toward the cockpit. I've already dealt with the captain. He thinks the engine failure was a mechanical fault. He won't remember the rest. Lynn nodded, not pressing. The small group stood in the aisle in silence for a moment. Finally, Lynn spoke. Sir Madam, he said, I have to go. Edward blinked. So soon? I need to report this to Makusa, Lynn said, looking at the child. Mr. Scamander needs to know. No one knows where the four went. They understood. The fragment had fled. What or whom it would possess next was unknown. It had to be reported to Newt at once. Anna wanted to say more, but only nodded. Be careful, Lynn replied, bowed slightly, and with a flash of golden red light, he was gone. 311, Chapter 311, Defensive Magic and Its Origins. Lynn had followed Newt, who had been released from the Magical Congress, for more than a month, trailing across America in search of any trace of the 17. From New York to Boston, Boston to Philadelphia, Philadelphia to Washington, and then all the way west from Washington, across plains and mountains, they chased that faint signal to the west coast. Newt's compass was unreliable. Sometimes it pointed steadily in one direction for ages, other times it spun as if possessed. They tracked that signal for thousands of kilometers, rifling through trash heaps, crawling through sewers, climbing rooftops, and wading through swamps. In the end, they found nothing. That half of the theme seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving not even a shadow behind. Newt, however, remained unnervingly composed. Every day he carried his suitcase, searching when it was time to search, and waiting when it was time to wait, his face showing no hint of anxiety. Lynn, after a month on the road, couldn't stand it any longer. His legs felt like they'd thinned to sticks. He was sick of the compass, got headaches from looking at Newt's suitcase, and would have gone out of his way just to avoid seeing them. As the start of the Hogwarts term drew closer, Newt suggested Lynn return to Britain first, and said he would contact him once there was news of the 17. Since it chose to hide, it won't show itself again for a while, Newt said calmly, feeding the small creatures he'd recovered back into his suitcase as he spoke. Besides, school is starting. Your studies matter. Lynn wanted to say his studies weren't that important, but there were only a few days before term began, and a little rest sounded appealing. After the past month, he felt more exhausted than after 3 Triwizard tournaments. Then I'll head back home first, Mr. Scamander. Newt nodded, said, stay safe, and that was all. Taciturn as ever, Lynn seriously suspected that if he put Newt and Ollie together, the two of them would barely manage 10 sentences between them all day. For the first time in a long while, coming home felt wonderful. Dudu had the house spotless, and his favorite dishes were warm on the table. He ate 3 bowls of rice and then collapsed into a disorienting nap. When he woke, the sun was already drifting west. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling for a while, before dragging himself up to gather supplies for the new term. There wasn't much to buy. Wand, cauldron, telescope, he had them all. A few new textbooks for the Fortine, and that was it. He flicked through the term's book list. The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 5, 2. Defensive Magical Theory, altogether not even half as bulky as the fourth-year list. The bookstore was as busy as ever. Diagon Alley at back-to-school time was a mass of students and parents. Lynn slipped and weaved through the crowd and finally squeezed into the 14 textbook section. Those few books were prominently displayed, stacked neatly with a small sign, 5th Year Essentials. He picked up the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 5, flipped through it, then set it down. He did the same with 2. Finally, he grabbed Defensive Magical Theory and leaned against the shelf to read. Chapter 1, The Definition of Dark Arts. Boring. Next chapter. Chapter 2, The Dangers of Dark Arts. What dangers could there be? They're useful. Next chapter. Chapter 3, The Theoretical Basis of Dark Arts. Lynn's brow furrowed. He flipped through more pages. Endless theoretical analysis, historical overviews, academic disputes, long citations of classics and authorities. Lines like the essential difference between dark arts and light arts lies in the caster's intent felt like empty rhetoric. He flipped ahead another dozen pages. Theory, theory, theory. No practical spells, no defensive exercises. Besides the odd cliché, the unforgivable curses are typical representatives of the dark arts. It was mostly moralizing. Wizards should shun the temptations of the dark arts. Lynn sighed for this year's Defense Against the Dark Arts class. He closed the book and went to the checkout. The queue was long. He stood at the end, half bored, flipping through Defensive Magical Theory. When he reached Chapter 7, he paused. At least it taught how to identify dark arts artifacts. Shallow, like a first-year primer, but not entirely useless. Lynn? A familiar voice behind him. He turned and saw Harry approaching, and beside him a tall man whose thin face still showed some lingering wariness, but whose eyes were bright and his step spirited, Sirius Black. "Good afternoon, Harry." Lynn tucked the book under his arm and nodded to both of them. "Mr. Black." When Sirius saw Lynn, his stride faltered. A complicated expression crossed his face. Wariness, maybe embarrassment. It didn't look natural. Lynn guessed what was on Sirius's mind. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lynn." Sirius's voice came out a little dry, as if it had to be coaxed past something. "Mr. Black." Lynn nodded again, smiling politely. "Long time no see. That thing in the Forbidden Forest. It was all a misunderstanding. You don't still hold a grudge, do you?" Sirius's face stiffened. Of course he remembered. Being floored by a third year's stupefy was humiliating. If word got out, it would cost him forever. "How could I?" he said, forcing magnanimity as a twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. "That little incident, I forgot it ages ago." His tone was firm, but his eyes kept shifting. Lynn let it drop. "You don't look well, Mr. Black," he said, changing the subject. "Haven't you been getting any rest?" Sirius reached up and touched his own face, as if surprised by his pallor. The past month he'd been running himself ragged preparing for Harry's trial, managing rooms, buying things, sorting old accounts. He hadn't had a decent night's sleep. "It's all right," he answered vaguely. Harry, watching his godfather's awkwardness, almost laughed. He knew Sirius too well. He said he'd forgotten, but there was no way he hadn't thought about it dozens of times. "Lynn," Harry interjected to save Sirius from further discomfort, "want to come over to my place for a bit?" Lynn blinked. "Will your uncle and aunt be all right with that?" Harry shook his head. "I'm living with my godfather now." He added with a smirk, "Sirius's cooking is terrible." Sirius's face darkened immediately. "How is my cooking terrible? Wasn't that steak yesterday fine?" "It was burnt. That was char-grilled aroma. Char-grilled aroma is burnt." The two of them bickered in the bookstore, drawing a few amused looks from the line. Lynn laughed. "Sure," he said, glancing between Sirius and Harry. "I'm free, so I can stop by for a bit." Before Sirius could answer, Lynn added, "But Mr. Black, if you really want to learn to cook, I can teach you. We can't have Harry eating burnt steak every day." Sirius opened and closed his mouth a few times, studying Lynn like he was deciding whether the offer was genuine or a tease. Lynn's face was so earnest it was hard to refuse. "Then I'll trouble you," Sirius said through gritted teeth. No trouble at all, Lynn waved him off. He looked at the long queue and the book in his hand. Once I've paid, let's go. All right, London. Grimmauld Place, not far from King's Cross, was shrouded in a hazy twilight. The streetlights hadn't come on yet. The sky hung in that uneasy in-between of dusk. The terraced Georgian houses stood in a neat row, windows shut and porches silent, looking like any old London neighborhood. Lynn followed Harry and Sirius around the corner into the square. As he steadied himself, a battered door seemed to materialize out of thin air between number 11 and number 13. The Fidelius charm? Lynn raised an eyebrow. Sirius nodded, proud. He pulled out his wand and gave the door a light tap. Metal clanked somewhere inside. Chains rattled. The door creaked open. A blast of musty air spilled out, the smell of ancient dust and a slow, indefinable rot. Sirius's expression stiffened for a moment, as if the house's smell had reminded him of something unpleasant. Come in, he said, his voice lower now, and stepped aside. Lynn crossed the threshold. Before he could take in the decor, the stench hit him full force, a putrescent, fermented smell that seemed to have festered in sealed wood for years. It was the sort of smell you couldn't quite describe, a thickness to it that made his stomach clench. "What is that?" he asked. Sirius didn't look well. Before he could answer, hurried footsteps thumped down the stairs. Lupin was practically running, hand clamped over his nose, other hand on the banister. He reached the landing, saw Lynn, and brightened. "Oh, Lynn," he said, lowering his hand, a sincere smile breaking through. "It's so good to see you." "Me too, Professor," Lynn replied. Lupin waved him off. "I'm not a professor anymore. Call me Lupin." He paused, then added with a wink, "Mooney is fine too." Lynn smiled back. He was about to ask what had been upstairs when he felt eyes on him. Something moved in the cabinet beside the stairs. "That's Creature," Sirius said from behind him, lacing contempt through the name. "A house elf. But he's gone mad, completely useless. Otherwise, we wouldn't be eating charred steaks every day." Lupin coughed, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested a memory he'd rather forget. "Greetings, Master." Creature shuffled from behind the cabinet, bowed so low his ears nearly scraped the floor, then straightened, mouth opening. "Get out of here, Creature," Sirius snapped, every syllable squeezed through his teeth. Creature's mouth snapped shut. He bowed again. "Yes, Master," he said and shuffled away, dragging his feet. "Master is a nasty, ungrateful scoundrel. If his mother knew, she'd be turning in her grave. Master has brought shame to the House of Black." His voice was low, but in the quiet hallway, every word rang clear. Lynn. This house elf was not normal. He'd seen over-enthusiastic elves in the Hogwarts kitchens, and Dudu, sharp and capable, but he'd never seen one muttering insults to his master's face. Sirius stood nearby, face red, the vein at his temple throbbing. Lynn guessed the former fugitive and current godfather wasn't in a talkative mood. "Lupin," he asked, turning to the werewolf who was still rubbing his nose, "what were you doing upstairs?" Lupin sighed and lowered his hand, clearing out magical objects. He glanced toward the stairs, a complicated look in his eyes. "This house has been in the Black family for generations. Who knows how many years' worth of things are hidden up there? Good, bad, dark arts, jinxes, curses, all piled up. I found a box upstairs, opened it," he shivered. "And that smell came out." Lynn's eyes lit up. "Dark magical items? Where? Take me to them." Lupin blinked as if he'd forgotten Lynn's other interests beyond fishing. "Then, you'd better be prepared. Hardly anything in there is normal." "Could they be any less normal than my potions?" Lynn waved him off. Lupin had no answer for that. Sirius, having recovered some composure, leaned in. "What does he mean by that?" he hissed. Lupin just patted him on the shoulder. "Come on," he said to Lynn. "The things are in a cabinet on the 3rd floor." They climbed. Lynn paused and looked back at Sirius. "Mr. Black, would you like to come up? In case there's anything good, I can help you appraise it." Sirius's mouth twitched. "What's there to see?" Accompanied by Sirius, Lynn toured the 1st and 2nd floors. The entrance hall was larger than he'd expected. The walls were hung with portraits of past Blacks in heavy gilded frames, men and women in clothing from different eras, each with the same proud, disdainful faces. The figures in the paintings moved and whispered like people. As Lynn passed, several of them turned to appraise him. "Who is this?" A witch with a powdered silver wig asked, snapping her fan and pointing. "A guest," Sirius replied curtly. The portrait's mouth snapped shut, clearly unsatisfied, but Sirius steered Lynn along. The second floor was worse, doors after shut doors, each seeming to hide some family secret. Sirius pushed a few open: bedrooms, a study, a drawing room, dark, heavy furniture, thick drapes, dust, and that same clinging scent of decay. "No one's really lived in this house since my mother died," he said. His voice was flat, but his hands pushed on the doors with force. "She wouldn't let anyone touch anything before she died, so everything's just been piling up." Lynn said nothing. He could see Sirius had complicated feelings about the place. They finally reached the room with the magical items. When the door opened, Lynn stopped short. The room was huge, with a soaring ceiling and tall glass cabinets lining the walls, packed with boxes, bottles, statues, masks, jewelry, books, and things he couldn't begin to identify. Dim wall lamps cast a weak glow. "Looks like the lair of some dark wizard," he noted bluntly. Sirius snorted, part agreement, part weary resignation. Lynn walked down the rows, eyes scanning. Everything had been arranged carefully: angles, spacing, positions. This was a show cabinet meant to impress. He found the cabinet Lupin had mentioned near an old armchair. "This is the place I hate most in the whole house," Sirius said, frowning as he stared at the glass-fronted cases. "If I ever do a proper clearing, the things in here will go first. Almost all of it is dark arts stuff. They loved this. They showed it off like treasure, as if it were something to be proud of." He idly picked out a small ball and turned it over in his hand. It was a solid orb, its surface carved with intricate runes, cool to the touch. Sirius frowned and shoved it back into the cabinet. Lynn's gaze drifted. In the center of a cabinet lay an open case on dark red velvet. Inside rested an Order of Merlin medal. Larger and richer than Lynn's, the front bore Merlin's profile. The back read, "Awarded to the House of Black in recognition of outstanding contribution to the Ministry of Magic." Sirius glanced at it with contempt. "This medal isn't worth what you think. Back then, a dark wizard was turning the world upside down, and the Ministry needed gold to recruit Aurors. The House of Black had gold. It was a mutual arrangement." "How much gold did it take to buy one of those?" Lynn asked. Sirius thought a moment. "Not sure of the exact amount. Seems it was traded for half a vault's worth." He let the irony hang there. "They thought it would bring honor to the family." Lynn clicked his tongue. Half a vault for a little medal, put on display as the house's centerpiece. The Blacks would pay a high price for prestige. At the bottom of the cabinet, an exquisite little mirror caught his eye. About palm-sized, its silver frame hand-carved with delicate, precise patterns. The glass was dulled by a thin mist. Lynn picked it up. The mist cleared, and a woman's face looked back, delicate features arranged in a way that made her look mean. Too high cheekbones, too thin a mouth, too narrow eyes. Alone, each feature might be fine. Together, they read as cruelty. Before Lynn could ask who she was, the woman spat, "You filthy." Her voice was a sharpened blade. Lynn's face darkened. He had never before been insulted so directly, let alone by a face in a mirror. Without a word, he tapped his wand to his ear and cast a silencing charm on himself. Sound cut off like a snapped string. The woman in the mirror kept moving her lips, but no sound reached him. Lynn inhaled and began his counterattack. "Fuck you." His voice exploded into the quiet room, clear, loud, and deliberately theatrical. "Fuck you, you uneducated ill-bred. I'll give you a 360 degree, no dead angle." He unleashed an astonishingly creative, fluent tirade. He ranged from family slights to sexual metaphors, from anatomical jibes to barbed comments about livestock and funerals, combining verbs and nouns with wicked precision. He shifted pace like a performer, rapid-fire bursts, then slow, devastating lines. The woman's face contorted through anger, shock, then bafflement. She clearly had never been handled like this. Sirius, watching, was speechless. He had imagined Lynn the straight-A, well-mannered student, the sort every professor praises and every parent brags about. Now he listened to a torrent of curses so inventive and ruthless that his notion of what a good student looked like suddenly seemed absurdly narrow. The mirror frame trembled. The woman's lips quivered, unable to get a word out. When Lynn finally stopped, he stood for a second, as if he could have gone on forever. He set the mirror face down on the cabinet and removed the silencing charm from his ears. Sound rushed back. Sirius exhaled a long, shocked breath. "You." His voice was shaky. Where did you learn all those words? Lynn considered, then answered solemnly, self-taught. Sirius's mouth twitched into a grin. He clapped Lynn on the shoulder. If you ever start a cursing class, I'll be the first to sign up. Chapter 313, Locket. Lynn's gaze returned to the display cabinet, and he began to rummage through it again. Snuff boxes that exhaled poisonous gas, glass bottles oozing with foul matter, notebooks that sprouted tentacles. Compared to the mirror that opened its mouth to curse people, these were child's play. At least the mirror had some personality. These things were just meant to disgust. Lynn could silence them with a flick of his wand, without even speaking. Far less trouble than arguing with that mirror. He moved quickly and soon had searched almost everything on the top shelf. Most were odd little trinkets, some obvious at a glance, others that took a second to puzzle out, but none of them were serious. Just as he reached for the second shelf, his hand stopped on something tucked away in a corner, buried under a thick layer of dust that hid its original color. He frowned and drew it out. What's this? It's filthy. Sirius Black, standing nearby, watched with twitching eyelids. Be careful, he warned. That might be some dark arts object, if it's cursed. Lynn had already brushed the dust off. It was a small box the size of a chicken egg, heavy in his palm, the metal cold under his fingers. The front bore an ornate S set with several small emeralds. Even in the dim light, the stones glowed faintly green. Their facets were so neatly cut, it was clear someone had taken great care with them. Lynn turned it over. No markings on the back. This isn't something from the House of Black, Sirius said, leaning in. I've never seen it. He hesitated, then dismissed it. Probably junk someone bought. Just throw it away. A sharp, piercing voice exploded from behind them. This is not junk. Sirius jumped and reached for his wand. Spinning around, he saw a creature less than 2 steps away, his large cloudy eyes fixed on the locket in Lynn's hand, eyeballs nearly bulging. Sirius's face darkened. He opened his mouth to scold the house elf, but Creature cut him off. This is Master Regulus's locket, he snapped, frantic. Creature brought it back. It belongs to Master Regulus. Lynn held the locket up and looked from the agitated elf to Sirius. Regulus? Who's that? Sirius's expression shifted. Something complex flickered across his face. My brother, he said quietly. Regulus Black. Remus Lupin came over. I remember him. He and Sirius argued all the time at school. Sirius snorted, reluctant. Yeah. The words hissed through his teeth. My weak-minded brother bought into my parents' pure-blood nonsense and even became a Death Eater. He stared at the locket, colder now. Throw it away. It's probably something Death Eaters use to hurt people. No, Creature's scream nearly lifted the ceiling. He lunged for the locket in Lynn's hand. Lynn flicked his wand. Creature froze mid-lunge astren, suspended as if someone had hit pause. His mouth hung open, fingers outstretched, eyes bulging, but he could not move. What's the hurry? Lynn said, bringing the locket back to eye level and turning it over. If it's a Death Eater's item, I all the more reason to open it. He found the seam and tried to pry the lid open. It did not budge. He forced himself until his knuckles went white. Still nothing. Wow, that's sturdy. Lynn set the locket in his palm, pressed his thumbs against the rim, and tried to pop it open with both hands. His face flushed with the effort. The box held fast, not even a crack. He let go and glared at it. Damn it. His wand slid out of his sleeve. With a flick, he pointed it at the locket. Sectum Sempra. An invisible blade shot from the tip of his wand, striking the seam. Metal screeched and sparks flew in the dim room. Then nothing. The seam showed no cut, no mark. For a long beat, no one spoke. Fine. Lynn exhaled and handed the locket to Sirius. It belonged to your brother. Try. Sirius weighed it in his hand, tried to pry the lid, then muttered several unlocking charms. None worked. A final blasting curse nearly blew apart the nearby cabinet. The locket did not so much as tremble. He tossed it back to Lynn. Can't open it. Lynn caught it and looked at Creature, still frozen. How do you open this? Creature's mouth was still agape, but he could not make a sound. Lynn flicked his wand and released the hush on the elf. Creature's voice came out high and thin, trembling. Creature doesn't know. Creature is useless. Creature couldn't destroy that locket. Failed Master Regulus's orders. Sirius's jaw tightened. He stared at the house elf, unwilling to accept it. Creature, how do you open it? Creature doesn't know. Then why did Regulus tell you to destroy it? Lynn cut through his wailing. Creature snapped his mouth shut, head bowed, tears falling, but he stayed silent. Speak. Lynn's voice remained quiet but heavy. Creature stayed mute. Sirius, growing impatient, stepped in front of him and glared. Why did Regulus have you destroy it? Answer me. Creature trembled. Creature doesn't know. His voice shrank. Only knows it was Master Regulus's order. Master told Creature to bring it back, told Creature to destroy it. Creature could not. Creature is useless. His words dwindled until barely a whisper. Sirius's face grew grimmer. He watched the elf, chest heaving, fists clenching until his knuckles whitened. Then why did this thing end up in your hands? He ground out. This time Creature did not claim ignorance. His body began to quake, the shaking starting at his fingertips and running up through his shoulders until his whole self trembled. One day, his voice broke and came out in staccato bursts, as if he were forcing himself to remember a nightmare. One day, Master Regulus came to the kitchen. He said the Dark Lord needed an elf. Lynn's prying stopped. Creature's voice grew smaller. The Dark Lord took Creature to a place, a cave. The Dark Lord made Creature drink water from a stone basin. The water was green, very bitter. Creature drank. Creature felt terrible, so thirsty. The Dark Lord made Creature drink more, and Creature drank. Tears streaked his cheeks. Creature was so thirsty, he drank the water. The basin dried up. The Dark Lord put the locket in the basin, then filled it with water again, and the Dark Lord left, leaving Creature there. He faltered, then continued. Creature went home. He told Master Regulus what happened. He looked up at Sirius. Master told Creature to take him to the cave. He took a locket from his pocket, just like the Dark Lord's. He told Creature to hold it, and when the stone basin was dry, to swap the lockets. His voice trembled again. He ordered Creature to go home and to find a way to destroy the locket they took. Then he drank all the potion. Master Regulus was dragged under the water. Thud. Sirius's fist landed on Creature's face. The elf, unable to move or defend himself, was knocked sideways. Why didn't you save him? Sirius's voice was raw, eyes bloodshot. Why didn't you save him? You were there. You watched. You just padfoot. Lupin grabbed Sirius by the waist and hauled him back. Calm down. Calm down. Let him finish. What more is there to say? Sirius struggled, eyes fixed on Creature. He watched my brother die. He did nothing. Creature couldn't, the elf cried, his voice rising. Master Regulus ordered Creature not to move. Creature cannot disobey orders. Creature is a bad elf. Creature is useless. Creature watched Master Regulus die. Creature. Sirius stopped struggling. Held by Lupin, he stood hollowed out, his fist still raised but his face drained. The room fell silent except for Creature's intermittent sobs. Lynn stared down at the little box in his hand. A single bold idea rose up inside him. A Horcrux. 314. Chapter 314. The Socket Genius's Perverse Pleasures. Horcrux? What's that? Lupin looked dazed. After being a 7 for so many years and serving in the Order of the Phoenix, he thought himself familiar with the dark arts. But he'd truly never heard that word before. Lynn opened his mouth to explain. Forget it. Sirius exploded, startling Lupin. Blood still welled at the knuckles of his clenched fists. His eyes were red, and his face kept shifting as though he were in the middle of a private torment. I'm going to bring him back. The words came out heavy, each syllable carrying absolute determination. Lynn and Lupin turned toward him. Sirius didn't look at them. He fixed his gaze on the locket in Lynn's hand, his voice raw. No matter what, I'm bringing him home. He should be home, not lying at the bottom of that damned lake. He spun and addressed Creature. The house elf sat huddled on the floor, tears streaming, his whole body shaking. Creature, I command you to take me to that 23. Bring Regulus home. Creature shuddered violently. Creature. His voice was thin and trembling. Creature will obey the young master's orders. Then let's go. Sirius strode forward and grabbed Creature's shoulder. He was quick, faster than quick, but Lupin was faster still. Remus wedged himself between Sirius and Creature, spreading his arms to block the way. Remus, Sirius snapped. What do you think you're doing? Lupin gestured, his face calm. Don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to stop you, but this is reckless. We're forgetting that that's where you-know-who hides things. I don't care, Remus. Sirius's jaw clenched. I don't care about traps or what's in there. I only care about one thing. I know, Lupin said, cutting him off. What I mean is, I'm coming with you. Sirius paused. Lupin said no more. He stepped forward, took Creature's shoulder with one hand, and placed his other hand on Sirius's arm. They looked at each other for a long, wordless moment in which everything was said. "Ready?" Lupin asked. Sirius nodded. Creature reached out with a trembling hand and gripped their robes. Crack. A sharp bang echoed through the room, and the three figures vanished. Lynn was left alone, staring at the locket in his hand and the place where they had stood. He clicked his tongue, shoved the locket into his pocket, and his 22 slid from his sleeve into his palm. Wuan. Clang. A gold-red light flared beside him. Warm sparks scattered across the floor as Wuan peered out of the glow, tilting its head. "Master, are we gonna fight?" Lynn said nothing for a beat. "Catch up to those three in front." Wuan flapped its wings. The gold-red light wrapped around them, and they vanished. The house elf apparition hit like being shoved into a drum, spun multiple times, and hurled out. When Lupin's feet found solid ground, his stomach rolled. The air was full of salt. Sirius swore under his breath and looked around at the jagged rocks, glancing up at the gray sky. "A house elf's way of traveling is not pleasant," he muttered. "Is that so?" A casual voice drifted from the side. Sirius's words died when he whipped his head around. Lynn leaned against the rock wall with his hands in his pockets, looking perfectly unruffled. Lupin opened his mouth in astonishment. "Lynn, how are you here?" Lynn spread his hands. "It's all apparition. Is it that hard for me to follow?" Both men gaped. Sirius stammered. How old are you?" "It's illegal without a license." Lynn blinked. "Oh, do you have evidence?" Sirius stood speechless for several seconds, then mechanically shook his head. "Then I didn't break the law," Lynn said matter-of-factly, nodding. Lupin cleared his throat, about to object. "Don't say anything about it being dangerous." Lynn cut him off. "If something goes wrong, you two might not be as safe as I am." Both men's mouths snapped shut. They exchanged a look that said they wanted to argue, but instinct told them otherwise. The two of them together might truly be less capable in a fight than Lynn. "All right." Lynn didn't wait for approval. He started down into the 23. "Don't dawdle. It's getting dark." Lupin and Sirius traded a glance and followed. The 23 was deeper than they had expected. The path narrowed, the rock walls closed in, and daylight vanished, swallowed by the thick dark. The air grew saltier and more oppressive. After walking for what felt like the length of a meal, the passage opened abruptly, and they found a wall. The wall sat at the heart of the 23, bare, undecorated, with no hint of human craftsmanship. Its very presence was telling. A natural wouldn't have a surface that flat. "It's here!" Creature's excited cry came from behind. The house elf had somehow scurried to the front and was pointing at the wall, trembling. He produced a table knife out of nowhere. Sirius frowned. "What do you need that for?" Creature didn't answer. Clutching the handle, he lifted the blade toward his own wrist. "This place needs blood to open. Creature's blood will do." As the knife began to fall, a hand shot out and snatched it away. Sirius held the handle and rolled up his sleeve, revealing his forearm. "I'll do it." Before the blade touched skin, another hand grabbed it. Lupin hid the table knife behind his back and looked at both of them without expression. "Both of you, settle down." "Remus, I said I'll do it." Voices rose. Sirius argued that, as Regulus's brother, he should be the one. Lupin claimed his experience made him the best choice for dealing with any traps. Creature wailed that it was his fault and he should atone with his own blood. Lynn watched them argue, stunned. He stared at the wall. From his level of 20, it was just a blood-activated door. Not a portkey, not some identity lock. The socket monster, he thought wryly, had a sick sense of humor. Lynn stepped back a few paces and raised his 22. Confringo. Boom. A massive explosion charm, far more powerful than an ordinary 17 could normally muster, burst from his wand and slammed into the rock. The wall shattered. Stone fragmented and dust flew. The entire wall split as if ripped by a giant hand, cracking into jagged pieces that scattered in every direction. Dust coated them all and made them choke. When the dust settled, a doorway gaped, its edges rough and rubble littering the floor. Beyond it stretched an even deeper darkness. Creature was first to move, screaming as he rushed through. "It's here! It's here! Creature will not be wrong!" Lupin and Sirius stood dumbfounded, looking at the blasted opening and then at Lynn, who had solved their debate with a single spell. It was a humbling feeling. "Let's go. What are you standing there for?" Lynn stepped over the rubble without looking back. The two men exchanged a look and followed. Beyond the doorway opened a vast six. They stood on the shore, the stone slabs slick beneath their feet, and before them lay a black expanse of water that seemed endless. The lake was as black as ink, heavy and motionless. Lynn's 20 cast a circle of light on the surface. Beyond that, the light was swallowed without causing so much as a ripple. Far off, as if at the center of the lake, a faint glow flickered. Creature moved in an old, familiar way to the water's edge and squatted, his hands fidgeting in the air as if feeling for something. Lynn cast a revealing charm. Light fell over the lake, and a thin chain appeared out of the darkness. One end vanished into the black water, the other connected to something being hauled up. The surface rippled. A prow broke the water, dripping, a small boat rising out of the depths. It wasn't large, barely big enough for 2 or 3. "It seems Lord Voldemort even needed a way to cross the lake," Lynn said with a touch of scorn. "He couldn't exactly swim, though with the way he looks, he is suited for soaking in water." Chapter 315. What's going on? The boat touched the shore. Creature was the first to leap out. The moment his toes hit the stone, he scuttled to the stern, clutching the gunwale with both hands and staring intently at the faint glow in the middle of the lake. Sirius followed in a single long stride. The boat wobbled as he found his footing. He turned and waited for Lupin. Lupin glanced at the small craft and then stepped aboard as well. His movements were steadier than the others, though there was still a quiet urgency to them. With the 3 of them on board, the boat sank noticeably, the waterline rising close to the gunwale. Lynn did not move. He stood on the shore, looking at the cramped little boat. With 2 grown men and a house elf already packed in, there was barely a palm-sized patch of deck left. Standing was out of the question. Even putting a foot aboard would have been awkward. His expression as he looked up at them was flat, the sort of look you give a fool. They felt the stare. Sirius scratched the back of his head. Lupin smoothed his clothes. Creature hunched his neck in confusion. None of them understood what was wrong. "Gentlemen," Lynn said, his voice carrying oddly in the hollow cavern, the tone implying, "Is there something wrong with your heads? Why are we here?" "To bring my brother home, of course," Sirius answered without hesitating. Lynn tilted his chin toward the little boat. "Then why get onto the boat? Isn't it the same to search from here?" There was a stunned silence. Without a word, they stepped off the boat and returned to shore. Their movements were smooth and deliberate, as if this was exactly what they had meant to do all along. The faint flush on their faces was snuffed by the night air. Only Creature remained on the stern, blinking as though he'd been left behind mid-thought. Sirius stood on the shore and stared at the lake's calm surface for a moment, frowning. "Do we need to touch the water to draw them out?" Lynn's contemptuous expression softened. He crouched at the water's edge. The lake lay dark and still, a pool of ink. He reached out a hand, fingers probing the surface. "Let's find out." The moment his fingertips broke the skin of the water, an icy chill crawled up his hand. No sooner had his finger dipped below the surface than the whole lake erupted. Pale, ghastly arms broke the surface in dense numbers, reaching like a forest of dead branches. Their skin was water-sodden and pallid, knuckles swollen, most nails gone, fingertips bare. They clawed for Lynn's hand, aiming to drag him down. Zzz! Boom! Blue-white arcs of lightning leapt from Lynn's fingertips. Each time a current struck an infurious arm, it went rigid and cracked. Then the limb exploded. The electricity spread through the water, racing from one pale limb to the next, creating a web of light that crackled across the lake and shook dust from the cavern walls. Several Inferi were blasted clear of the water, flying through the air before splatting onto the stone shore. Sirius rushed forward, 16 in hand. He knelt and pried open the jaw of the first corpse to see the face beneath. No. He shoved it aside and checked another. No again. The third, the fourth, the fifth. "Lynn, ease up on the blasting," Sirius called without taking his eyes from the bodies. "You're making them hard to identify." Lynn gave a short nod, and the lightning around his hands cooled slightly. He began sending precise arcs at the inferi that had already come to the surface. Each time one was blasted free, Sirius would hurry over to identify it. Lupin and Creature moved in to help. Creature, eyes wide, pointed and shouted, "There!" whenever he thought he saw the right face, and Lynn would strike in that direction. Sirius checked. Lupin waited close. If it wasn't Regulus, they'd either fling the Inferius back into the water with a flick of Lupin's 16, or finish it with a fire spell. They fell into a clear, efficient rhythm. But after a long stretch of searching, Lupin's wand arm was nearly spent, and there was still no sign of Regulus. "Maybe he's not in there," Lynn muttered, pausing his current. "It's Master Regulus." Creature's voice shrieked so high it nearly made their teeth ache. Lynn followed the direction of Creature's hasty finger. Near the shore, a body was drifting up. A very young man, skin long since bled of color, clinging to bone, cheekbones sharp, eyes hollow. His clothes were sodden and indistinct, a faint blur of an emblem at the collar. But that face, they all saw it at once. It could have been Sirius the moment he came out of Azkaban. Sirius froze, then lunged toward the water. Lupin grabbed him in time and held him back. Lynn didn't speak. He flicked his 6 and a rope shot from its tip, looping perfectly around the corpse's waist. He gave it a gentle tug. The body slid up onto the shore and lay there, dripping on the stone. Sirius went to his knees and reached out with a trembling hand to touch the pale, wet face. The contact hit him like a physical blow. Then he laughed, a ragged, broken sound, and tears started to run down his cheeks. "He's Regulus. He is. This is Regulus." His voice broke, rose, and fell. "Ha ha ha! I found him. I found you." He gathered Regulus's body into his arms and clutched him tight. Creature crouched beside them, convulsing in a keening that shook his small frame, fingers buried in the hem of Regulus's robes, refusing to let go. Lynn looked back at the lake. Pale hands still reached and crawled toward the shore. Because he had paused, many of them had taken the chance to come up. The nearest were within 3 feet of his heels. He smiled, lips pulling back to show bright teeth. "Damn it," he said, voice echoing through the cavern. "I've put up with you lot long enough." The sound rolled across the water like a stone dropped in a pond. The inferi hesitated as if startled, then began to surge faster. Lynn raised his 16. Streams of fire burst from its tip, gold and red, molten and volcanic, lighting the black cavern. The walls, hidden for years, were revealed in brutal detail. The inferi recoiled. Flames swirled around Lynn like dragons. He stood in their center, the hems of his robes whipping in the heat. The cold cave warmed with visible speed. Lynn swept his 16 forward, and a roaring tide of fire surged out, an enormous wave that swept across the lake. The instant the first wall of flame licked the black water, the lake itself seemed to scream. Stagnant water that had lain undisturbed for ages boiled where the fire touched it. The inferi writhed in the flames. Lupin was forced back several paces by the heat. He raised an arm to shield his face and watched through his fingers as the whole cavern filled with golden red fire. Heat hit him in waves. His skin prickled and his lashes curled. The lake shrank. Water steamed away. Steam burned off. Water level fell until the bed was exposed. The stones of the lake bottom baked dry. Where water had been there was only ash, thick, white ash that covered the whole floor. Lynn sheathed his 16 and brushed the soot from his hands. Lupin watched him with a complicated expression. "What is it?" Lynn asked. "Nothing," Lupin said. Lynn nodded but didn't press. He went to Sirius and looked down at Regulus still held in his arms. "Let's go," he said quietly. "It's time to go home." 12. Grimmauld Place. They had only just returned to the third-floor storage room when Harry, feather in hand, spun around at the sound of their arrival. He had been pacing anxiously among the dark arts artifacts. He looked as if he'd been doing so for quite some time. His face shifted from alert to joy to relief and then to confusion as his eyes flicked from Lupin to Sirius to Lynn and finally to the thing Sirius held in his arms. For a moment he thought it was an object, and only seconds later did he realize it was a person. Harry, we're back." Before Harry could reply, a flare of red fire blossomed in the room. When it dimmed, Fawkes stepped out of the flames, talons still hooked in a collar. He released his hold, landed on a cabinet, and cocked his head, regarding them. "Oh, Harry." Dumbledore's voice sounded, as if someone had just been dragged from sleep. "Why did you summon Fawkes?" He looked around at the scene, bafflement plain on his face. "Regulus? What happened?" While the others began to form an account, Lynn reached into his pocket and took out the 10, handing it to Dumbledore. Dumbledore examined it for a beat, then raised an eyebrow as he looked up at Lynn. Lynn answered with a cheeky grin and a satisfied nod. Dumbledore's bewilderment deepened into an expression that mixed surprise and something like quiet, reluctant approval. Dumbledore arrived and left quickly. He had come empty-handed, but when he went, he carried not only the locket, but Regulus as well. It was the sort of thing that felt like taking everything that wasn't nailed down. At first, Sirius protested, but Dumbledore only had to say 2 sentences before Sirius relented. "You don't want Regulus buried like this, do you?" That was the first. "I'll go find Severus. He should be able to restore him to his original state." Sirius and Snape didn't get along, but Sirius respected Snape's skill with potions. Gritting his teeth, he took the risk. Perhaps because Regulus had been found, Creature's cooking improved overnight. That evening, the group sat in the dim dining room of the Black House and stared at the spread in front of them. Lynn took a piece of toast and bit into it, crispy outside, soft inside, perfectly warm. He took a piece of salmon next. It was seasoned just right and practically melted in his mouth. He glanced at Creature standing nervously nearby, the house elf watching his every chew as if worried a frown might appear. "Not bad," Lynn said. Creature's eyes lit up. He bowed his head, mumbled something, and shuffled back to the kitchen, his little bounce betraying his pride. "Still a bit worse than yours," Harry mumbled from across the table with his mouth full of toast. Lynn wasn't modest. Naturally, after dinner, Lynn planned to leave. He'd been at Grimmauld Place long enough. He'd seen what he needed to see and heard what he needed to hear. The locket had gone to Dumbledore, and Regulus had been taken away. But when he rose to go, Sirius pressed a hand firmly on his shoulder. "Why are you leaving?" he asked. His tone allowed no argument, and the grip was strong. "You've helped me so much. You're not even going to let me give you a proper meal?" Lynn opened his mouth to say the meal had been his treat already, but Sirius lowered his voice. "Besides," he said, "you can browse the Black family's collection as you please. Just don't damage anything." Lynn sat back down. Sirius laughed and rapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him hop in the chair. "That's more like it." While Creature tidied the kitchen, Sirius led Lynn toward the basement. The stairs to the lower levels of Number 12 Grimmauld Place were narrower than Lynn expected. Only one person could pass at a time. The walls were rough stone, bare of decoration, with a few small wall lamps set into crevices and throwing a dim yellow light. At the bottom, Sirius stopped in front of a fireplace. The hearth was empty. The iron surround looked streaked and blackened. He felt along the right side of the mantel, found an unseen mechanism, and pressed. A moldy cabinet in the corner thunked and slid aside. A spacious passage opened before them. The corridor was wide enough for 2 to walk abreast and not very long. After about 20 steps, the space opened into a huge room. Lynn stood in the doorway and looked in. Nearly 100 bookshelves rose from floor to ceiling, each packed with volumes. Spines in every color and condition faced outward, some gilt titles still bright, others faded to illegibility. But every book looked dusted and cared for. The room was well lit. "Not bad, right?" Sirius crossed his arms in the doorway. "Everything the Black family accumulated over the centuries is here, though I haven't read most of it." Lynn walked between the stacks, eyes sweeping from one shelf to the next, then back again. He recognized many names on the spines: The Origins and Evolution of the Dark Arts, The Complete Guide to Ancient Runes, The Limits of Transfiguration, A Potion Master's Private Notes. There were also volumes he'd only ever seen listed in the Hogwarts Restricted Section catalogs, books that on the school shelves were marked missing or to be supplemented. He remembered the long-ago rumor about Phineas Black during his tenure as headmaster, that countless precious books had vanished from Hogwarts, not merely borrowed but removed and erased from records, likely spirited away to the Black House. Phineas, of course, never admitted it. From his portrait, he would turn red and shout, "This is slander, and I, Phineas Black, am an upright man," over and over for 100 years. Still, standing in this room, Lynn had no trouble believing the stories. Too many of the books that had been missing from the restricted section were here. He pulled one from the shelf, Secrets of the Wand. The cover was dark brown, corners worn down, the gilt on the spine blurred but legible. He remembered reading a note in an alchemy text that mentioned this book recorded a spell capable of eliminating the priori incantado effect. He had searched the entire restricted section for it and found nothing, and for a time had wondered if the spell had ever existed at all. Now the book was in his hands. The title page bore a faded Hogwarts library stamp, and in small handwriting beside it, donated by Phineas Black. Lynn stared at that line for a long moment. Donated. He imagined someone taking books from the school shelves, storing them in his house, and then writing donated on the title page. What was the difference between that and a thief arranging stolen goods in his parlor and scribbling a gift from a friend beneath them? He flipped the book open and found the spell. It was short, only a few paragraphs, and the wording wasn't complicated. He read it once and understood it. Then another spine caught his eye. Advanced Dark Magic Revealed. He knew that book well. Professor Quirrell had given him a copy in his first year, calling it an unabridged original. Later, he discovered the pages dealing with Horcruxes had been torn out, and he'd been furious enough to almost burn the book. He shoved it into the bottom of his trunk and never opened it again. Now, the volume on the black shelf looked much newer than his, corners unfrayed, no cracked spine, as if rarely handled. He checked the table of contents and found the chapter on Horcruxes. The procedure wasn't as abstruse as he'd imagined. The steps were laid out clearly, the principles straightforward, far simpler even than some aspects of alchemy. If he wanted to, he could have used this book to make a Horcrux right then and there. After indulging a little curiosity, Lynn wandered the stacks again and selected several more. The connection between ancient runes and alchemy, reverse analysis of curses, conservation of matter and transfiguration. He carried them to a desk in the corner, sat down, and began to read. Sirius lingered in the doorway for a while. Then, seeing Lynn had no intention of stopping soon, said he would get some sleep and left the library to its silence. Chapter 317. Then he really should be dismissed. The start of term was approaching, and Lynn had finally come home. The moment he pushed open the door, Dudu poked her head out from the kitchen, glanced at him and said, "Master has starved himself thin while off fishing," then ducked back to continue cooking. Lynn lingered in the hallway for a moment and touched his face. He didn't feel thin. Still, after more than a month spent running around, nothing tasted as good as home cooking. He had thought about staying another day at Sirius's house. After all, the Black family library was enormous, nearly 100 bookshelves of centuries-old collections. It took 3 days just to skim the sections he was interested in. Sirius had come down a few times with food to find him hunched over a notebook on ancient runes. Lynn had flipped through it so quickly that Sirius assumed he was just browsing, but after watching for a while, he realized Lynn paused on every page. He wasn't skimming, he was reading very fast. "Do you usually read that fast?" Sirius asked at one point. Lynn didn't even look up. "Pretty much," he said. Sirius muttered to himself for a while and left. Lynn heard the tail end of it, something like, "No wonder he could get an order of Merlin." Lynn had just set down his trunk and was planning to crawl into bed to be near his pets when a soft flutter came from the window. An owl carrying an envelope flew crookedly into his room, landed on the desk, released its claws, and dropped the envelope with a thud. It stood there, tilting its head to look at him, refusing to leave. Lynn reached over, took the envelope, and peered at it. "From Hogwarts?" He turned it over in his hands. "Haven't I already gotten my book list?" The owl cocked its head. It didn't understand. "I'm hungry. Do you have any food here?" it seemed to ask. It wasn't one of the regular Hogwarts owls. He knew that flock well, every one of them as arrogant as Old Eight. This one was probably a temporary recruit. With a casual flick of his wand, an unopened bag of beef jerky floated from the kitchen cabinet and landed on the desk. The owl dipped its beak, took a peck, chewed, its eyes lighting up before taking another peck. "Thank you," it said. Lynn raised an eyebrow. This owl was polite, much better than Old Eight, who, when hungry, would glare and complain, Why did you only just get back? This bird is starving," and then rummaged through the kitchen itself. He casually slit open the envelope. A soft little chime sounded as a badge and two letters slid out together. The badge was yellow metal, with a large letter P and a carved badger next to it, a prefect badge, clearly Hufflepuff style. The badger's lines were bold and deeply engraved. It felt textured under his fingers. Lynn turned the badge over twice, murmuring, "A prefect badge? Can I say no to this?" No one answered. The owl was still busy with the jerky. Lynn set the badge aside and unfolded the letters. The first was a standard appointment letter from Dumbledore. Brief congratulations on becoming a prefect, and a hope that he would set an example and assist the professors in maintaining order. Nothing surprising. The second letter was also from Dumbledore, but written in that slightly teasing tone he used sometimes. "Mr. Lynn," it began, "by the time you see this letter, I believe you will already have been made a Hogwarts prefect. Don't be in such a hurry to burn it. It won't be too late to burn it once you've finished reading." Lynn paused with the wand in his hand. The next paragraph read, "By the time you read this, I will probably have temporarily left Hogwarts. I hope you won't be too hasty in refusing your prefect appointment. You can help make sure Professor McGonagall doesn't have to work so hard." What? Lynn frowned. What did being a prefect have to do with McGonagall's workload? What exactly could he do as a prefect? Enforce discipline? He was the one who needed discipline the most. Patrol the corridors? He used every trick he knew to evade the professors on his nightly wanderings. Was he supposed to turn around and catch other students sneaking about? That felt like betrayal. The letter ended there. Lynn flipped it over. Nothing on the back. "Damn it," he muttered. "I hate cliffhangers." The next day, King's Cross was as busy as ever. At the entrance to platform 9 3/4, parents pushed luggage trolleys, owls flew overhead, and several first years clutched their parents' coats, faces pale with nerves. Lynn hauled his trunk through the crowd, tracked down the Hogwarts Express, and checked the carriages one by one. He pushed open the door of the last compartment and found Ollie sitting by the window, a stack of documents spread out in front of him. Ollie glanced up, nodded, and then returned to his papers. "Haven't Edgar and the others arrived yet?" Lynn asked as he put his trunk on the rack and sat opposite. "No," Ollie said without looking up. "Tsk." Lynn leaned back and crossed his legs. "To think there would be a day when I got here early." Ollie lifted his eyelids over a financial report and gave him a look that said, "So you noticed." Lynn pretended not to care, pulled a packet of beef jerky from his pocket, opened it, and offered a piece. Ollie accepted it and chewed slowly. "How was your break?" Lynn asked. "Every time I messaged you, you said you were busy." After chewing, Ollie finally gave a short list. Company, studying, extracurriculars, practice. "Then you were busier than I was," Lynn said, sincere. Ollie just nodded. They sat, one reading financial reports, the other eating jerky, as the flow on the platform thinned and the station whistles blew, calling last passengers aboard. Just as the train was about to move, the compartment door was thrown open and Edgar and William barreled in, breathless and late. "What on earth took you two so long?" Lynn made room. William wrestled with his trunk, trying to cram it onto the rack. After struggling a while, Lynn flicked his wand and the trunk floated up, settling neatly. William pushed his glasses up, exhaled, and began to complain. "Don't ask. The minister's lot have gone mad. They had a bunch of aurors at the station entrance, claiming to run safety checks for students." "Safety tests my foot." Edgar flopped down next to Ollie and was already shouting. "The aurors were handing out exam papers at the gate." "Exam papers! Have you ever seen a safety test that involves handing out exam papers?" Lynn's confusion deepened. Aurors handing out exam papers? In his 4 years, he had never heard of such a thing. Weren't aurors supposed to catch dark wizards and protect the wizarding world? When had they turned into examiners? "What do you mean?" he asked. Edgar dug in his pocket, produced a crumpled sheet, and smoothed it on the little table. It was a typed A4 questionnaire, poorly printed on thin, translucent paper. At the top, in bold, it read, "Hogwarts Student Safety Survey." Lynn skimmed it. Question 1. Are you satisfied with Albus Dumbledore serving as Hogwarts headmaster? Satisfied. Dissatisfied. Unsure. Question 2. If dissatisfied, please indicate the areas of dissatisfaction. multiple choice. Outdated management style, improper use of personnel, lacks oversight in the selection of defense against the dark arts professors, condoning student misconduct. Other, please specify. Question 3. What major mistakes, if any, do you believe Dumbledore has made during his tenure as headmaster? Please explain briefly. Question 4. Have you heard of the special friendship between Dumbledore and Gellert Grindelwald? Do you believe this relationship has affected his judgment? Question 5. Do you believe Dumbledore bears partial responsibility for the current instability in the wizarding world? Lynn flipped the page to find questions 6, 7, and 8, each one asked in different ways about Dumbledore. Not a single question addressed actual safety measures, how to deal with dark wizards, or the students' own welfare. Everything was about one thing: what's wrong with Dumbledore? He scanned the first page again to make sure he hadn't missed anything. "Isn't this just a survey?" he said, putting the paper back on the table. "Isn't it easy to answer? Just tick satisfied for everything. Is there even a second option?" The compartment fell quiet for a beat. "It's just that the questions are a bit—" Edgar scratched his head and trailed off. Everyone understood the unsaid implication. Lynn suddenly remembered Dumbledore's letter. "Temporarily left Hogwarts. Help make sure Professor McGonagall doesn't have to work so hard." At the time, he'd assumed Dumbledore had business elsewhere. Now, looking at a survey clearly aimed at undermining Dumbledore, Lynn felt the situation might be more complicated. "Wait," he said, then shook his head. "Have you heard any rumors that Dumbledore is about to be dismissed?" Edgar blinked, then burst out laughing. "Dismissed? Who? Dumbledore? Come on." He laughed until he had tears in his eyes. "Even if my dad were sacked, nobody could sack Dumbledore. He's the greatest wizard of our time. Who would have the guts?" Edgar had a point. Lynn let the worry slide for the moment. He reached into his robe, took out the prefect badge, and pinned it to his chest. "You lot go on chatting. I'm going to patrol the train." He stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind him. Edgar's voice drifted through the crack in the door, incredulous. "No way! Him as a prefect? Has Dumbledore gone senile? Then he really should be dismissed." The train was already pulling out. London shrank behind them, and fields and hedgerows slid by. Students walked the corridors. Some nodded at the prefect badge on his chest. Others hurried past. Lynn didn't care. He strolled from the last carriage to the first and back again. Around the fifth carriage, a cluster of first years hovered by a compartment door, peering in with anxious faces. A girl inside was crying quietly, her face streaked, a textbook open on her lap. Her classmates tried to comfort her, but the more they did, the harder she sobbed. Lynn leaned in. "What's the matter?" The first years turned, and seeing the badge on his chest, looked like they'd found a savior. "She lost her book. It's the—" The speaker's voice shook so much she couldn't remember the title. "The Standard Book of Spells," the girl by the window wailed. "I put it in my bag, but it's gone. It's brand new, and I haven't even read it yet." Lynn tapped his wand. A soft hum came from the luggage rack. The girl's backpack shifted, its zipper unfastened, and a brand new textbook floated out and settled into her hands. "Thank you," she sniffled, face still wet but smiling. Lynn nodded and moved on. He continued his walk, passing compartments where some students played cards, others talked, and a few were bent over last-minute summer homework. A Hogwarts tradition. Some things never changed. Outside, the sky was darkening, lights beginning to dot the hills. Hogwarts was drawing near. The train slowed. The wheels' steady grind against the rails changed from hurried to languid, and the scenery outside stopped, flickering past. In the distance, Hogwarts Castle loomed, its windows pinpricked with light against the black sky. The carriage erupted into noise, and the corridors filled. Because the prefects had to keep order, Lynn and the others were the last to leave. Only after the students ahead had poured out did they step from their compartment and make their way down the empty corridor to the doors. A thin night mist drifted over Hogsmeade Station as they stepped onto the platform. An unfamiliar witch stood there holding an oil lamp. She wore a dark brown traveling cloak, her hair twisted into a tight bun, and she was calling the first years together at the top of her lungs. Lynn paused at the train door, watching her and rubbing his head. He leaned toward William and asked quietly, "Do you know her?" William pushed his glasses up, glanced at the woman, and shook his head. No. Where's Hagrid? Edgar, looming in from the side with a smug look on his face, answered before William could. That's Wilhelmina Grubbly Plank, he said. A fairly well-known magizoologist. You remember that article about unicorn social structure in Transfiguration today? She wrote it, and the study on bowtruckle language in Magical Creatures Quarterly. Her work, too. She's pretty famous in the field. Lynn stared at him. Edgar normally copied Ollie's history of magic homework. How did he suddenly know so much about magizoologists? How do you know that? Lynn asked. Edgar scratched the back of his head and grinned. She went abroad to study foreign unicorns and got into some trouble with the local authorities. My dad had to bail her out. Lynn thought for a moment. Edgar's father, Edward Burns, worked in the Department of International Magical Cooperation, handling cross-border magical affairs. Bailing out a magizoologist who ran afoul of foreign regulations would fit with his job. So your dad helped her? Not exactly knows her, Edgar qualified. He just handled some paperwork and paid a fine. She wrote him a huge thank you letter afterward. My mum read it and said the woman sounded interesting. William pushed his glasses up and looked concerned. Magical creatures. He hesitated. They wouldn't be replacing Hagrid, would they? The group went quiet. Lynn shook his head. Probably not. Being gamekeeper isn't something anyone can do. The Forbidden Forest's huge and full of creatures. Hagrid's been there for years. He knows every path, every burrow, and the temperament of every animal. Whoever took over would need years just to learn the terrain. William accepted that, and they joined the throng toward the carriages. 10 minutes later, they stopped at the stone steps. Lynn jumped down and glanced toward Hagrid's hut. No smoke curled from the chimney, no light shone from the windows. The little house sat dark and still, as if someone had pressed pause. Through the castle entrance hall, the marble floor clattered under hundreds of feet. Torches along the walls flared, stretching long shadows. They followed the crowd toward the doors on the right that opened into the great hall. Lynn took his seat at the Hufflepuff table, and before he could relax, glanced toward the staff table. Dumbledore's seat was empty, as he had expected, but one of the other seats was occupied, Sirius Black. The fugitive who had escaped Azkaban and been cleared years ago sat at the staff table, wearing a well-cut dark gray robe and sporting a short haircut that made him look unexpectedly presentable. He perched a little awkwardly in the chair, trying to look like a properly respectable teacher. Sirius met Lynn's puzzled gaze and gave him a thumb, an improvised signal of approval that made the corner of Lynn's mouth twitch. The Sorting Hat's song this year was worse than usual. In past years, the Hat's rhymes had at least been tuneful. This year's effort sounded shredded and stitched back together, every note landing oddly. The lyrics wandered through repeated, awkward themes: unity and mutual aid, fearlessness in the face of tyranny, and holding on to one's heart in the darkness. And it left most of the students rubbing their ears while the staff exchanged embarrassed looks. When the song finally ended, there was a smattering of applause from the professors and a lot of relieved sighs from the students. Professor McGonagall rose and unrolled the long roll of parchment in her hands. Ewan Abercrombie. A nervous-looking boy stepped from the line of first years, legs wobbling as he climbed onto the stool. The Sorting Hat shouted as it settled on his head, "Gryffindor!" One by one, the new students were called, sat on the stool, and were sorted into their houses, greeted by applause. The line shortened. Half an hour later, the last new student had been placed in Hufflepuff. McGonagall rolled the parchment up and sat down. Students reached for plates, anticipating the banquet, when the great hall doors opened again. The sound was small but crisp in the suddenly quiet room. A squat woman, pink from head to toe, pink cardigan, pink headband, pink handbag, walked to the front of the staff table and paused, surveying the 4 house tables with an expression that suggested she was already making lists of things to correct. McGonagall gave a helpless sigh and stood. Her voice carried to every corner of the hall. Before the feast begins, I would like to introduce our new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for this year, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, Professor Dolores Umbridge. Umbridge stepped into the center of the high table and bowed with the practiced, saccharine cadence that made Lynn's stomach turn. Her voice was unnaturally sweet and measured, every syllable artificially softened, like someone forcing herself to sound gentle. "Thank you, Professor McGonagall." She nodded at McGonagall and then addressed the students as though coaxing children. "I am honored to be here at Hogwarts, this historic school of witchcraft and wizardry. The Ministry of Magic cares deeply about the quality of education at Hogwarts and places great importance on the growth of every witch and wizard." She went on in a stream of diplomatic platitudes about the ministry and Hogwarts, moving forward hand in hand, creating a better learning environment, and how defense against the dark arts was an essential skill every witch and wizard should master. It was a lot of words that said very little and mercifully brief. She must have known she wasn't popular. After a short self-introduction, she handed the floor back to McGonagall. Professor McGonagall glanced at Sirius and then at Grubbly Plank, apparently deciding to get all announcements out at once. There are a few more new faces to introduce. Sirius Black will be serving as a Transfiguration teaching assistant at Hogwarts this year. A ripple of shocked whispers swept the hall. The man who had been imprisoned in Azkaban, wrongly imprisoned, everyone knew, was now a teaching assistant? Some students gasped, others craned their necks to look at the staff table, and many murmured to their neighbors. Sirius returned the stares with composed nods to the hall. Wilhelmina Grubbly Plank, McGonagall continued above the din, will be serving as the temporary instructor for care of magical creatures. The chatter swelled. Where was Hagrid? Why wasn't he teaching? McGonagall did not explain Hagrid's absence. She waited until the noise subsided a little, and then announced one final, quieter matter. "Headmaster Dumbledore is currently on leave, and I will be acting headmistress for the time being." Silence fell for a moment, then whispers resumed, this time subdued. Dumbledore on leave was hardly as startling as the other news. After decades of tireless work in the wizarding world, the idea that he might take a holiday was not, to most students, cause for alarm. Chapter 319, I'm in a Hurry Morning. Lynn sat at the dining table, staring at the timetable in his hand with a puzzled look. He had flipped the schedule over several times to make sure he wasn't misreading it. But the week was packed. From Monday to Friday, morning to night, almost every slot was filled. Worse, several subjects had double periods, double transfiguration, double potions, double defense against the dark arts. Even history of magic had 2 consecutive lessons. Professor Binns was soporific enough on a good day. With 2 consecutive periods, they might sleep through his lectures until the end of term. Since arriving at Hogwarts, Lynn had never seen so many classes crammed into a single week. First and second year had been fairly relaxed. Third year increased. Fourth year was already busy. But compared to fifth year, fourth year had been a holiday. Is it because it's fifth year and we're preparing for OBULs? Lynn thought, but the schedule still felt extreme. OWLs were important, but not enough to justify this marathon of lessons. Don't the professors need rest? The first class was Transfiguration, Sirius's. Lynn folded the timetable, tucked it into his robe, drained the last of his pumpkin juice, and stood up. "Let's go," he said. "Let's see how Professor Black teaches." The Transfiguration classroom was on the 3rd floor. When they arrived, it was already crowded, more than Professor McGonagall's usual classes. Almost everyone was there. Even the habitual latecomers had arrived early and were whispering in their seats. Lynn scanned the room. It wasn't just Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws. A few Gryffindors and Slytherins sat along the walls in their house robes, pretending to audit the lesson. Their necks were craned, eyes bright, clearly there for the spectacle. "There are quite a few people," Edgar said as he sat beside Lynn, lowering his voice. "It's fuller than McGonagall's class." William pushed his glasses up. "He's a legend. Escaped Azkaban, wrongly accused for 12 years, cleared his name, and now back as a professor. That kind of past draws people." The chatter swelled. Some guessed Sirius would be strict. He was a Black, after all. Others insisted he would be easygoing. He'd been a Gryffindor. Some thought he couldn't teach at all. No one could convince anyone else. Just then the classroom door opened. Sirius walked in, smiling, looking surprisingly pleased. Not the face of a man burdened with teaching duties, more like someone happy to be at a reunion. "Hello, everyone," his voice carried. I don't think I need to introduce myself. None of you should fail to recognize me. A beat of silence, then laughter. Indeed, everyone knew his name. The Daily Prophet had mentioned Sirius Black as often as anyone except Harry Potter and Dumbledore. The laughter died off. Sirius cleared his throat, shifted the textbook from one side of the podium to the other a couple of times as if finding the right spot, then spoke. As for transfiguration theory, I won't go into too much detail, he admitted with an oddly candid look, because I'm not very good at it either. More laughter. Lynn smiled at Sirius's unabashed honesty. So we'll go straight to practice in the first class. Sirius clapped his hands. At once, a rat in a cage appeared on every student's desk. Edgar's hands were lightning fast. He shoved his books back into his bag the moment he saw the rat. He loved practical work, as long as it wasn't sparring with Lynn. This year's transfiguration will involve human, animal, and object transformations, Sirius continued. Professor McGonagall asked me to have you practice animal transfiguration. Now, you can try to your heart's content. He went behind the podium, pulled out a chair, and prepared to sit. For a moment, the room was quiet. Students looked at each other, hesitant to be the first. They had covered some animal transfiguration theory last term, but jumping straight into practice without warm-up always felt odd. Professor Black? A Hufflepuff voice called. Sirius paused, then looked toward the sound. What is it, Miss Abbott? Hannah Abbott stood, fingers twisting the edge of her robes, nervous. What are we supposed to turn the rat into? Sirius blinked. He hadn't thought that far through. After a pause, he said, something alive, but not the original rat. He added quickly, just changing the color doesn't count. Turning a gray rat white doesn't qualify, nor does making it multicolored. A low chuckle ran through the room. All right, let's begin. Sirius settled back, crossed his arms, and watched. The classroom came alive, wands waving, spells whispered. Lynn tapped his wand once against the rat. Its gray-brown fur lightened to pale brown, its paws darkened, its tail shortened, ears rounded, body growing plump. Seconds later, a chubby hamster sat in the cage, its tiny front paws pressed to its chest, looking innocently at him. Edgar leaned over. Is that a hamster? Yes. Lynn prodded the cage with his wand tip, and the hamster curled up. On the podium, Sirius's eyelid twitched. He finally understood why Dumbledore had told him. Lynn didn't just know how to fight. His skill across various branches of magic bordered on genius. It was effortless, and he would be hard-pressed to deny it. 10 points to Hufflepuff. The class continued. Sirius got up now and then to walk among the desks, commenting on students' work, then would return and sit. He looked relaxed, even leisurely, hardly the nervous first-time professor he might have been. Lynn, with nothing pressing to do, kept practicing. He turned the hamster back into a rat, then a badger, a miniature lion, an eagle. He was having fun and lost track of time. All right, Sirius's voice called as the hour drew to a close. Before we finish, turn the animals back to their original rats and leave them in the cages. You don't need to pack them. Someone will collect them. Students hurried to comply. Lynn reverted his rat, shut the cage, and pushed it to the corner of his table. He glanced at the wall clock, 3 minutes until the end of class. By the way, Sirius said as if he'd remembered something, next week's class will be transfiguration practice again. We'll try more complex animal transfigurations. You can preview in advance, if you can find the materials. Lynn thought that McGonagall must have entrusted Sirius with practice, not only because he was a legendary figure, but because he knew how to make students want to learn. The bell rang. Students packed up and filed out. The next lesson was potions. Being late was a bad idea, especially with Snape. He was in a foul mood most of the time. Lynn and his roommates walked briskly toward the dungeons when footsteps approached from around a corridor bend. Lynn was still chatting with Edgar about his bright green rat from class. Mr. Lynn. A voice that made the skin crawl stopped them. Umbridge stood in the corridor, smiling in a way that set teeth on edge. Professor Umbridge, is there something I can help you with? Lynn's tone was flat. Umbridge waddled forward with her characteristic gait. Her upper body barely moved, while her lower body propelled her like a pink ball on wheels. She stopped in front of him, looked up, and said, Do you have a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss. Lynn frowned. They'd only met at the opening feast and hadn't spoken since. What could she want? He checked his phone. Professor, can it wait until after the next class? I'm in a hurry. Potions. Professor Snape. He emphasized Professor Snape. At Hogwarts, everyone knew what being late for Snape meant. Losing points was the least of it. Umbridge's smile froze for a beat, then resumed, but her tone had hardened. It's best to do it now. Lynn's frown deepened. Just then, his phone chimed. He pulled it out and saw a message from Ernie Macmillan with a picture attached. Snape standing at the potions podium, expression stormy. The text read, Snape's already in the classroom. Hurry up. Lynn's eyes widened. Sorry, Professor. He shoved the phone back into his pocket. I'm really in a hurry. Without waiting for a reaction, he strode off in long, fast steps, robes flapping. Umbridge watched him go, her smile stiff. She turned to Edgar, who was about to follow. Mr. Burns. Edgar froze. His face twitched. Sorry, Professor. I'm in a hurry, too. Snape's class. You know how it is. He ran after Lynn, leaving Umbridge alone in the corridor, her expression dark. When Lynn and his companions reached the potions classroom, it was already full. Snape stood behind the podium, his face as dark as a thundercloud. His gaze scanned the door and lingered briefly on Lynn before sliding away without comment. Lynn ducked his head, slipped into the last row, and sank into a seat. Snape did not take roll. He said slowly, Turn to page 394. The rustle of pages filled the room. The page described brewing the draught of living death, a complex potion requiring timing accurate to the second and a very delicate perception of magical nuances. Snape's mood made the atmosphere sting. His barbs in class were sharper than usual. Several students were called on. If they answered wrong, they lost points. If they answered right, they still lost points, apparently for the tone of their response. Lynn bent over his cauldron, hands moving, but his mind was elsewhere. Umbridge's smile or Snape's venom, which was more unpleasant. Chapter 320. What do you think of the Ministry of Magic? Since the start of term, Lynn had been plunged into an almost unbearably busy schedule. From the moment he woke up until classes ended at noon, he was occupied. The afternoons were just as full, and some nights he still had to do patrols, duties that, although not daily, came around once or twice a week. The rest of his time was swallowed by homework. Even fishing, his favorite pastime, had grown rare. He supposed this was the lot of a fifth year. With the OWLs looming, the professors were cramming information into the students' heads, and the students were cramming it back in, forcing facts into places that often didn't fit. Next year would be even busier, choosing NEUT classes, then graduation, then finding work. A lifetime of busyness, unless something unexpected happened. Time slipped by in this hectic rut until Friday morning, when Lynn had his first Defense Against the Dark Arts double period of the year. He wasn't looking forward to it. Based on the textbook Dolores Umbridge had chosen, Defensive Magical Theory, the course was doomed. He'd glanced through the book in Diagon Alley. It was all theory, not a single practical defensive spell worth the name. It would be useful for writing a dissertation on the dark arts, perhaps, but worthless for actually defending against them. By the time he reached the classroom, Umbridge was already seated at her desk, still in that putrid pink ensemble. A cardigan the exact color of bubblegum, a bow at her collar, a hair clip to match, and even pink nail polish. She sat with her hands folded over a pristine copy of the textbook. There were no creases on the pages, no notes in the margins, no sign that anyone had actually used it. It looked as if she had just bought it and set it down. The students sat in tense silence. Lynn took a seat in the back and let his eyes drift. When the bell rang, Umbridge rose and surveyed the room with a smile that was more like a grimace. Before we begin, she announced, there are some rules you must follow. She paused, seemingly expecting a response. When none came, the smile stretched wider. First, she said, holding up a finger, when answering a question, you will add Professor Umbridge at the end. For example, yes, Professor Umbridge, or no, Professor Umbridge. She cleared her throat and scanned the room. Is that understood? A few seconds of silence, then a chorus of yes, Professor Umbridge. Understood, Professor Umbridge. Yes, Professor Umbridge. She nodded, satisfied, and held up a second finger. Second, absolute silence in this classroom. No whispering, no passing notes, no making unnecessary noise without permission. She raised a third finger. Third, raise your hand to speak. Do not speak without permission. And She held up a fourth finger. Fourth, questioning the teachers is not permitted. The room was so quiet you could hear birds outside the window and your own heartbeat. Lynn, listening to the four rules, actually felt a little nauseous at the smugness of it all. This was the same old spoon-fed model. I talk, you listen. I tell, you obey. I ask, you answer. Good, Umbridge said, folding her fingers and smiling again. Now turn to chapter 1. Pages rustled. Umbridge flipped the book open, pointed at the text, and drawled, Ready, read. The students stared at one another in confusion. Read? Read the textbook? This was Defense Against the Dark Arts, not a reading class. Umbridge's voice rose. What are you waiting for? Read. Lynn felt insulted. Even Lockhart, who he disliked, had at least put on a performance. Umbridge was too lazy to teach. She would simply have the students read aloud. He pushed the book aside, leaned on the desk, and fell asleep. When the bell rang at the end of morning lessons, Lynn woke and began to follow the other students out, only for Umbridge to call after him. Mr. Lynn, you will have time for a little chat today, won't you? She glanced at Edgar Burns, who was trying to slip past, and added, And Mr. Burns, you come along as well. Lynn yawned and nodded. Edgar froze, bewildered. He hadn't expected to be involved at all, but he gritted his teeth and followed. Fourth floor, Umbridge's office. After going through countless occupants, the room had been transformed into a single, overwhelming theme. Lynn paused in the doorway and took it in. Everything was draped in frills. The lectern had a white lace cover, the bookshelves hung pink ruffled curtains, the windows had pink frills, and even the plant pot on the sill wore a pink ruffled cozy. Decorative plates lined a wall, each painted with a brightly colored large cat wearing a bow, the same bow as the one on Umbridge's cardigan, in varying shades of pink, blue, yellow, and purple. Lynn sank onto the sofa without being invited, sat back, and waited. Umbridge didn't keep him waiting long. I wonder what Mr. Lynn's plans are for future development, she purred. A senior undersecretary of the Ministry of Magic, establishing herself as a new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher and immediately wanting to discuss future development, was obvious in its intent. Lynn thought for a moment, then answered casually, No plans. I'll graduate from Hogwarts first, then see. Her smile tightened. And after graduation, have you considered any particular career? I haven't decided, he said. Maybe I'll take a year off and travel. I visited a few places over the holidays and found them interesting. I'd like to see more. Clearly not satisfied, Umbridge turned to Edgar. Mr. Burns, your father does excellent work in the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Have you considered following in his footsteps and serving the ministry? Edgar looked taken aback. He had assumed he was only there to fill a seat. He stammered. I haven't decided yet, Professor Umbridge. Take your time, she cooed. You're young. You have many years to consider. The doors of the ministry are always open to talented young people. The ministry. Lynn stood up. He'd had enough. Professor Umbridge, he said, if that's all, we'll be going now. We have another class. Edgar rose so quickly, it was as if he'd been waiting for the words. Umbridge's voice softened into office platitude mode. Of course, I appreciate your time. If you need anything, my office is always open to you. They left. As the door swung shut behind them, Umbridge's face soured. Ungrateful, are we? She muttered. She took out her telephone and dialed Fudge. The line rang only a few seconds before it was picked up. Fudge's slightly hurried voice came through. How are things going, Dolores? Minister,